Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Claire Bennett had forgotten about Ashwood. She had spent years burying the memories. Long summers running through the thick trees, whispered secrets with Marissa under the canopy of green. The way the town always felt just a little too still, a little too wrong. But the letter had changed everything. It had arrived without a return address. The envelope yellowed and crinkled as if it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. Inside, the paper was thin, the handwriting unmistakably familiar. Claire, please come back. I need your help. I never left. You have to remember, before it's too late. Marissa. Her hands had trembled as she read it, her breath catching in her throat. Because Marissa was dead. 15 years ago, Claire's best friend had vanished into the woods, the same woods they had been warned about since childhood. There had been search parties, candlelight vigils, and hushed conversations behind closed doors. The town had mourned her. The authorities had called it an accident, a tragic case of a lost girl who never made it home. But Claire had never believed that. And now, this letter existed. She had tried calling the number she still had memorized, but it had been disconnected years ago. She had searched for any record of Marissa online. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed outside of Claire's own memories. And maybe that was the worst part, because Claire wasn't sure if she even trusted those memories anymore. She should have ignored the letter. She should have burned it, thrown it in the trash, let it slip from her mind like a dream upon waking. Instead, she packed a bag and booked the next bus to Ashwood. The town hadn't changed. It was still small, tucked away from the rest of the world like it had been forgotten by time. The roads were cracked, the buildings leaning just slightly, the people moving too quietly. Claire stepped off the bus and adjusted her bag over her shoulder, her stomach tight with unease. The air smelled the same, wood smoke and damp earth, but something about it felt different now. It felt watchful. A few people turned their heads as she walked down the familiar streets. Some stared openly, their expressions unreadable, as if trying to place her. Others avoided her gaze entirely. When she reached the old Bennett house at the end of Maple Street, she hesitated before knocking. Her mother opened the door a few moments later, her face pale and drawn. "Claire," she breathed, her grip tightening on the doorknob. "What are you doing here?" Claire pulled the letter from her coat pocket and held it up. "I need to know if this is real." Her mother's face darkened. "Where did you get that?" "I told you. It came in the mail." "That's not possible." Claire's pulse quickened. "Why not?" Her mother swallowed hard. "Because Marissa is gone. And if you got this letter." She trailed off, eyes darting to the window as if afraid someone might be listening. Claire took a step forward. "Mom, what aren't you telling me?" A long silence stretched between them. Finally, her mother exhaled shakily and whispered, "You need to leave. Now, before it sees you." Claire's blood ran cold. "Before what sees me?" Her mother grabbed her arm, her grip too tight, too desperate. "You shouldn't have come back." And behind her, from somewhere deep in the woods, a light flickered in the darkness. Claire barely had time to react before her mother yanked her inside and slammed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, followed by the chain, then the deadbolt. "Mom, what the hell? Are you alone?" Her mother's voice was low, urgent. "Yes. What's going on?" Claire's heart pounded as she turned to face her mother fully. "Why are you acting like this?" Her mother's gaze flickered to the window again, her face pale. "You need to stay inside, at least until morning." Claire frowned. Because of the light, her mother stiffened. Claire hadn't meant to say it. It had just slipped out. But as soon as she did, something in the air shifted. The house felt smaller, the shadows deeper. Her mother's hands trembled as she rubbed her arms. "You remember?" A memory stirred in the back of Claire's mind. Something long buried, like a dream she had forgotten upon waking. The woods, the distant glow between the trees. Marissa's voice whispering, "It's watching." But that wasn't possible. That had been years ago, hadn't it? Claire's head ached, and suddenly, the walls of the house felt suffocating. She shook her head. I don't know what I remember anymore. Her mother reached for her, her grip gentle this time. Then listen to me. You need to forget. Claire pulled back. I can't. Marissa is gone. The words hit her like a slap. Her mother softened. I know what you think you saw, but you don't understand, Claire. No one comes back from those woods. Claire's fingers curled around the letter in her pocket. Then how do you explain this? Her mother inhaled sharply, as if she was about to say something, then stopped. Her expression turned guarded. Just promise me you won't go looking for her. Claire hesitated. She wanted to promise, but she couldn't. Instead, she lied. Okay. Her mother didn't look convinced, but she let out a slow breath and turned toward the hallway. You should rest. You've had a long trip. Claire nodded absently. Yeah, sure. But as her mother disappeared into the other room, Claire walked to the window instead. Outside, the town was quiet. No one on the streets. No movement at all. Just the dense black of the trees in the distance. And then a flicker, a faint, pulsing glow between the trunks. Claire's breath caught. It was waiting. Claire woke with a gasp, her pulse hammering. Her room was dark, the only sound her ragged breathing. But something felt wrong. Her fingers twitched against the bedsheets, and that was when she noticed it. Her shoes. She had left them by the door when she arrived, clean, untouched. But now they sat at the foot of her bed, caked in dried mud. Her stomach turned. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, heart racing. Her hands hovered over the shoes before she dared to pick them up. The mud was still damp in some places, and mixed within it small, dead leaves. Forest leaves. Did I go outside? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to remember anything past lying down. But all she could grasp were flashes of a dream, or what she thought was a dream. She was in the woods. The trees were black silhouettes against a sky that seemed too vast, too open. The air buzzed like static, thick and pressing against her skin. And then, Marissa's voice, calling her name, urgent, come closer. Claire's eyes snapped open. A chill swept over her. Had she been sleepwalking? Had she actually gone into the woods? She glanced toward the window. The trees loomed just beyond town, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. And then a flicker, a pulse of light, slow like the rhythm of something breathing. Claire's fingers dug into the muddy shoes. Her mother had been right. She never should have come back, but it was too late now. The woods were already calling her name. Claire barely slept after that. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt like she was somewhere else, standing beneath the trees, bathed in that pulsing, golden glow. By the time morning arrived, she was exhausted but determined. She had to know what happened last night. Her mother was already in the kitchen, gripping a cup of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. She barely glanced up as Claire entered. Morning, Claire said, forcing her voice to sound normal. Her mother's eyes flicked to her, quick, assessing. Did you sleep? Claire hesitated. Yeah, a lie. Her mother didn't call her on it, but something about her expression darkened. Claire poured herself a cup of coffee, but didn't sit. Instead, she moved to the window, staring at the line of trees in the distance. I was thinking of going into town today, she said casually. Maybe ask around. Her mother stiffened. About what? Claire turned to face her. Marissa. Her mother set her cup down with a quiet clink. Claire. She wrote to me. Claire cut in. You saw the letter. Someone put it in my mailbox. Someone knew I'd come back. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Claire exhaled, rubbing her temple. Look, something's not right here, and I need to find out what happened to her. Her mother was silent for a long time. Then, almost too softly, she said, Did you check the door? Claire blinked. What? Her mother's grip tightened around her coffee cup this morning. When you woke up, did you check if the front door was locked? A cold weight settled in Claire's stomach. She hadn't. Without another word, she set down her coffee and strode toward the front door. Her mother didn't try to stop her. The deadbolt was still locked. The chain was still latched, but the latch on the doorknob was undone. The kind of lock you would only turn from the inside. Claire stepped back. The room felt suddenly too small, too quiet. If she had sleepwalked into the woods last night, she would have had to unlock the door herself. So, why was there a set of muddy footprints leading from the woods to the porch? Claire stood on the porch, staring at the muddy footprints. They led from the forest to her front steps, stopping right at the door. The prints were deep, the impression of a single pair of shoes pressed into the damp earth. But the size was odd, too large to be hers. Someone had been here last night, watching, waiting. A shiver crept down her spine as she turned back inside. Her mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had seen the footprints too. "You need to let this go," she said quietly. Claire clenched her jaw. "I can't." Her mother didn't argue. She just sighed, rubbing at her temple as if fighting off a migraine. "If you're going to town, don't stay out past dark." "I won't." Claire grabbed her coat and keys before stepping out onto the porch. She could feel her mother's eyes on her, but she didn't look back. She had somewhere she needed to go. Marissa's house was exactly as Claire remembered it. Same white siding, same weather-worn shutters. It stood at the very edge of town, near the tree line, its backyard nearly swallowed by the woods. But something about it felt off. The paint hadn't peeled. The porch swing still hung in place, unmoving despite the wind. The windows were too clean, as if no dust or time had touched them. As if it had been preserved. A chill swept over Claire's skin. This house had been empty for 15 years. It shouldn't look the same. She hesitated at the front steps before reaching out and testing the door. It swung open without a sound. Her breath hitched. Someone had been inside recently. She stepped over the threshold, the wooden floor groaning under her weight. The air inside was still, heavy with the faint scent of dust and something else. Something familiar. Something like earth. The hallway stretched before her, untouched. The furniture was in the same place as she remembered, the small wooden table by the door, the old clock that had always run 5 minutes slow. The last time she had been here, she and Marissa had been 13. They had sat in Marissa's room, whispering about the strange lights in the woods. That was the night Marissa had disappeared. A floorboard creaked above her. Claire froze. The house was supposed to be empty. Slowly, she reached in her pocket, pulling out her phone. No signal. Something shifted in the air, a soft whisper. Not words, not quite, just the sound of something moving upstairs. And then a single thump, like a footstep. Claire's blood turned to ice. She wasn't alone. Claire's heart pounded as she took a slow step forward. The noise had come from upstairs. Her instinct screamed at her to turn around and leave, but she couldn't. Not when she was this close. The wooden steps groaned beneath her weight as she ascended, the dim light filtering through the dust-covered windows, casting long shadows on the walls. She reached the second-floor landing, eyes scanning the hallway. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The faded floral wallpaper, the doors that had once led to Marissa's parents' bedroom, and the tiny bathroom at the end of the hall. And then there was Marissa's room. The door stood slightly ajar. The whispering sound was gone now, but the silence felt heavier. Claire swallowed hard, then pushed the door open. Her breath caught in her throat. The room was untouched. Marissa's bed was still made. The pale pink comforter smoothed neatly over the mattress. The posters on the walls, ones Claire vividly remembered from their childhood, hadn't faded. A pair of sneakers sat by the dresser, clean as if they had just been placed there. It was exactly the same, like Marissa had never left. Claire's fingers tightened around her phone. This wasn't possible. She stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath her. The air felt thick, almost electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. And then she saw it. The closet door was open, a dark gap in the corner of the room, just wide enough for a person to slip through. Claire's breath came faster now. She could hear something inside, something slow and deliberate. Breathing. She took a shaky step toward the closet. Marissa, the breathing stopped. The silence stretched. Then a single whisper. "You came back." The voice was wrong. Not Marissa's. Too hollow. Too stretched. As if spoken through teeth that weren't used to forming words. Claire's blood turned to ice. And then, from the darkness inside the closet, a pale hand slid into view. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the pale hand slid into view. It was too long. The fingers stretched unnaturally, the skin grayish and smooth, like something that had never seen sunlight. The nails were short, ragged, bitten down to the quick. The thing in the closet wasn't moving, but it was waiting. Claire's body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She was rooted in place, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then it moved. A second hand appeared, fingers curling around the doorframe. And then a face. It wasn't Marissa. The eyes were too wide, too dark and wrong. The mouth stretched slightly, as if trying to smile, but not quite remembering how. And then, in a voice that was almost, but not quite Marissa's, it whispered, "You should have come sooner." Claire's paralysis broke. She stumbled backward, heart pounding, nearly knocking over the desk as she turned to flee. The house felt smaller now, the hallway stretching and twisting, the light outside dimming like the sun was setting too fast. She ran for the stairs, but when she reached the top step, the front door was open. She had left it closed. Cold air rushed in from outside, and beyond the porch, she saw it, the light in the woods. It pulsed slow and deliberate, like the rhythm of something breathing. And for the briefest moment, Claire felt it calling her. A sharp whisper behind her shattered the trance. "Don't go yet." Claire spun, expecting to see the thing from the closet, but the hallway was empty. No shadow, no whispering. The air was silent. The house was watching. Claire didn't wait. She ran. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the overgrown path from Marissa's house. Her legs burned from the effort, but she couldn't stop. The sensation of the thing in the closet, its eyes, its voice, still clung to her like a shadow. The light from the woods flickered at the edge of her vision, and her instincts screamed that it was following her, drawing closer. But when she reached the edge of the woods, the pulsing glow had dimmed. For a moment, she dared to look back. Marissa's house was silent, standing dark and still behind her. But the air was thick with the hum of something alive, something watching. She had to fight the overwhelming urge to turn around and run back. Run right into that darkness, into the hands that waited. Instead, Claire forced herself to take another step, then another, until the trees fell away behind her. By the time she reached the main road, the light had faded completely, and the town felt even more desolate than it had before. The next morning, Claire woke in a panic. She hadn't slept. She hadn't even been able to close her eyes without feeling the weight of that presence on her chest. The air in her room was thick, like someone was standing just beside her, their breath hot against her skin. And then there were the footprints, the ones that hadn't been there when she went to bed. She hadn't dared look out the window yet, but she knew what she would find. Claire quickly threw on her clothes, grabbed her phone, and rushed to the front door. When she pulled it open, her stomach dropped. The footprints were there, but not just hers. A second set, barely visible, but still there. The prints were deep, the shape unmistakable, and they led from the edge of the woods to her door. Something had been here. Claire's hands shook as she backed away from the door. The footsteps were fresh, and they were still here. The town was still, eerily quiet, as Claire walked down the dirt road. The weight of the footprints pressed heavily on her mind, pulling at her thoughts like a dark thread, urging her back toward the woods. She couldn't stay in town, not like this. Not when she felt that something was coming for her. Her steps quickened, heart racing. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe an answer, maybe an explanation. Maybe she just needed to understand why it was following her. Her feet carried her to the edge of the woods, the trees looming like dark sentinels. For a moment, she hesitated. The memories of last night, of the house, of the thing in the closet, came rushing back. But the light, the pulsing glow, was calling to her. The light she had seen from the window, from the porch, the one that had never let her go. It was waiting. Claire stepped into the trees, her breath tight. The silence in the forest was profound, as if the world had quieted itself just for her. She pushed forward, branches brushing against her arms, the scent of wet earth filling the air. And then she saw it, the clearing. It was just as she remembered it from her childhood, from the strange stories that had never made sense, stories about things in the woods. The grass was damp with dew. The sky above a strange, murky gray that seemed to pull the light from the air. But there was no light, nothing, only shadow. Claire stood frozen, scanning the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't what she had expected. The glow, the pull of the light had always been so strong, so constant. But now it was gone. Marissa, her voice trembled as she called into the stillness. There was no answer. Claire stepped further into the clearing, eyes darting around, searching. And then she saw her, standing in the center of the clearing. It wasn't Marissa, but Claire's stomach lurched as though it were. The figure was too familiar, but it was wrong. The same pale skin, the same wild hair, the same stance that Claire had seen only in pictures. But this was not Marissa. Her eyes were empty, hollow. Claire's breath caught. She felt a jolt of recognition. "You," Claire whispered, her throat dry. "You're..." The figure didn't speak, but it stepped closer, slowly. And as it did, the shadows around it began to shift, like they were moving of their own volition. The air grew colder, the feeling of unease tightening around Claire's chest. It was as if the forest was alive, feeding off the figure's presence. The figure reached out with one hand, long, too long, fingers stretching impossibly thin. Claire recoiled, stepping back. And then the figure spoke. "You were supposed to stay away." The voice was Marissa's, but twisted, like it had been buried under years of rot. Claire stumbled back, eyes wide in terror. "No, you're not Marissa." But the figure laughed, a strange, hollow sound, like something scraping against the bones of the earth. "I was Marissa," it said softly, its smile widening unnaturally. "But now I'm more." Claire's mind spun. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. The forest, the ground beneath her feet, it felt like it was shifting, like it was bending toward her, pulling her into something deeper, something darker. "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't you. This isn't her." The figure stepped closer, and Claire could feel a coldness in the air, like ice settling into her bones. Her heart was hammering in her chest, and the forest seemed to close in around her. "You don't understand," the figure said. "You never did. Marissa was only the beginning. The light chose her, but it chose you too." Claire's legs shook, her body screaming for her to leave, to run. But something rooted her in place, a force she couldn't escape. "You've been marked," the figure continued, its voice softer now. "And you will never leave, not until you become what it wants you to." Claire took a step back, eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hands and pointed toward the sky. The shadows deepened, swirling like a storm. The ground beneath Claire's feet seemed to shift again, and suddenly, she could hear it, a faint, whispering hum in the distance. The light. It was back, but it wasn't the gentle pulse she had seen before. It was wild, urgent, and hungry. It was drawing closer. The hum of the light grew louder, its presence now undeniable. Claire could feel it, a force pulling at her, tugging on her very soul. The figure standing before her, its hollow eyes fixed on her, seemed to sense it too. Its twisted smile spread wider as the shadows thickened around them. The figure's voice echoed in the air, a chorus of distorted whispers now filling the space between them. "Do you feel it?" it whispered. "The light. It's calling to you. It's always been calling to you." Claire's breath came in shallow gasps. Her heart raced as her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows were alive, shifting and pulsing like the light itself. "I didn't ask for this," Claire said, her voice trembling. She forced herself to stand tall, her fists clenched at her sides. "I didn't choose this." The figure tilted its head, eyes narrowing as if contemplating her words. "You think you didn't choose it, but the truth is, it stepped closer, its voice low and honeyed now. You've been part of it from the very beginning." Claire felt a cold wave of dread wash over her as the figure's hand reached toward her. She stepped back, her mind racing. The light was almost here. She could feel it pressing in from all sides, its warmth and its hunger too much to resist. The figure's voice broke through her thoughts, sharper now. "You're running out of time. The light knows your name, Claire. It's chosen you." Claire's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of the truth sinking in. This wasn't just about Marissa anymore. It was about something much older, something that had waited in the woods long before either of them had been born. The light, the shadows, they were all part of it. And Claire, whether she liked it or not, had been part of it too. But there was a choice here. Claire realized that now. The figure wasn't just an echo of Marissa. It wasn't just a shadow of what had come before. It was something more, something that had come to her because it knew she was the next step. Claire's eyes snapped toward the growing light. It was closer now, stretching and reaching toward her, its warm glow somehow cold at the same time, an insidious pull she couldn't ignore. And she knew she had to make a choice. "You have to decide." The voice came from behind her, a soft whisper in the air. Claire turned quickly, heart skipping a beat, but there was no one there. The forest stood silent, the air thick with the weight of what was coming. She faced the light once more. It was beautiful, yes, but in a way that felt wrong, like a thing that could swallow her whole, take everything she knew, and leave her with nothing. Or perhaps that was exactly what it wanted. Her mind raced. If she stepped into the light, if she let it consume her, would she become like the figure? Would she lose herself in its endless hunger, become a part of something bigger, but empty? Claire took a step back, her mind made up. No, she couldn't give in, but she couldn't leave either. Not now, not after everything she had seen. The figure's laughter rang in her ears, mocking, taunting her. "You think you can resist it? You can't. None of us can. The light, it's not something you can fight. It will consume everything. Everything." Claire's hands shook, but she stood her ground. She wasn't sure what to do, but she knew she couldn't run anymore. She had to make a stand. The light was closing in, the shadow reaching out to pull her in. She could almost hear the whispers, the beckoning voices of the people who had been lost to the light before her. And then, just as the light seemed about to engulf her completely, something shifted in the air. A crackling sound, like static, rippled through the clearing. The figure hissed, stepping back. No, it's too soon. "You." Claire's body tensed as a voice, clear, familiar, cut through the chaos. "Claire." It was her mother's voice. Claire's heart raced as the world around her seemed to tilt, the light flickering as though it couldn't quite decide what it was supposed to be. Her mother's voice was a tether, pulling her away from the edge. Claire turned toward the sound, the clearing fading behind her as she stumbled forward. The air seemed to part before her, the shadows thinning, the light retreating. It wasn't gone, but for a brief moment, Claire could breathe again. "Mom!" Claire whispered, but there was no answer. Claire looked up, and the world around her seemed to settle. The forest no longer felt like a trap, but like a place she could leave. The air, though thick with the aftershocks of the light, felt clearer. But something told her this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Claire's feet pounded against the dirt path as she made her way out of the woods. The light, now receding into the shadows, still pulsed faintly in her mind, its pull lingering like the echo of a dream. Her heart was still racing, and her thoughts were tangled, but she forced herself to move. She had made her choice, but she didn't know yet if it had been the right one. The trees around her no longer seemed like silent sentinels. They were waiting, watching. The rustling of leaves in the distance made her pause, but the sounds were growing fainter, not closer. The light might have retreated for now, but she knew it wouldn't be gone forever. It was always there, just on the edge of her vision. As Claire reached the edge of the forest, the world around her felt different, heavier, somehow. The air tasted strange, and the distant sound of rushing wind through the trees felt like a warning. She stopped at the clearing, where the forest opened to a quiet patch of grass, its edge curling up against the road that led back to town. She took a deep breath. The sky was still gray. the clouds heavy, but there was a brief moment of silence. Then, the familiar sound of someone calling her name, so faint she might have imagined it, yet so real. Claire! Her mother's voice. She froze. It was the same tone as before, that gentle beckoning pull. It felt like it was coming from the woods again, like it was inviting her back. Claire's breath hitched. Her mother had been dead for years. There was no way. She clenched her fists, refusing to turn back. She didn't want to listen. She had already gone too far into the woods to turn back now. Whatever that voice was, it wasn't her mother. With a final glance toward the trees, Claire started walking toward the road again. The sound of footsteps followed hers, steady and rhythmic, just a few steps behind. It wasn't until she reached the main road and took her first step onto the familiar gravel that she heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a voice, it was a presence. She could feel the weight of it in the air around her. Her skin prickled as though the very atmosphere was charged with something unseen. Claire's stomach churned, her pulse quickening as she forced herself to walk faster. And then, the sound she had been dreading. Footsteps. Heavy. Close. Behind her. Her legs froze. The footsteps echoed through the empty road, the sound distorted and uneven, like they didn't belong. She glanced over her shoulder, heart leaping into her throat. There was nothing. The road was empty. The trees in the distance were still. Nothing moved. But the footsteps, they were still there, following her. Claire's breath came faster as she turned forward again. She broke into a sprint, the gravel scraping underfoot as she raced toward town. Every step felt like it took her deeper into something, into danger, into something she couldn't escape. But just as the town came into view, something cold and sharp grazed the back of her neck. Claire whipped around, but the road behind her was still empty. Except for one thing, a small, flickering light in the distance. Not the light from the woods, not the warmth she'd felt there, but something darker, more malignant. It hovered at the edge of the forest, a single pinpoint of brightness. The more she stared at it, the more she felt herself being drawn toward it. The footsteps behind her grew louder again, and she realized it was following her. She wanted to turn and run, but her feet felt like they were planted to the ground. It was as if the very earth beneath her was holding her back, urging her to stay. And then, just as she thought she might collapse under the weight of it all, a figure appeared from the darkness ahead, someone familiar. Claire. Her heart stopped. It wasn't her mother, but the figure in front of her was too close. It couldn't be anyone else. It was Marissa. But this wasn't the Marissa Claire had known. Her eyes were too hollow, her movements too deliberate, like she wasn't quite in control of herself. Her skin was pale, and her mouth stretched into a smile that wasn't quite right. The light, Claire realized, was coming from her. Marissa, what happened to you? Claire asked, her voice shaking as she tried to back away. But the more she moved, the closer Marissa seemed to come. The light around her flickered, like it was alive, pulsing in time with Claire's quickened heart. You can't run from it, Claire, Marissa said softly, her voice whispering like it came from somewhere far away. It's already here. It's always been here. And now it's waiting for you. Claire felt a cold knot form in her stomach. No, she wouldn't be like Marissa. She couldn't let the light take her, like it had taken her. You don't understand. Claire shook her head, her breath catching in her throat. I won't let it take me. Marissa's eyes glowed with an unsettling brightness. It's not about letting it, Claire. It's already inside you. She stepped closer, the pulse of light growing stronger as it enveloped her. The light knows you, and soon you'll know it too. Claire backed away, but Marissa followed, the light wrapping around her like a tangible thing. It burned, but it didn't hurt. It was real, and it was there. Claire's chest tightened. She had made her choice in the woods, but now she felt a wave of doubt. Had it been enough? Had she truly escaped? No, there was no escaping it now. The light had found her, and it wasn't going to let go. Claire's breath came in frantic gasps as the light around Marissa intensified, illuminating the dark road in an eerie glow. The world seemed to fade away, the trees and the town in the distance barely visible as the pulse of the light drowned them out. Marissa's face, though familiar, was distorted by the glow, her features almost too sharp, her eyes too bright, as if something deep inside her had been altered. The smile on her lips stretched wider, unnatural, like it had been carved into her face. "You can't fight it, Claire," she said softly, the words almost a song, a lullaby woven with a strange, sorrowful note. "The light wants you. It always has." Claire backed up further, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground as she tried to make sense of everything that was happening. Her head was spinning. Marissa was dead. She had been dead for years. How was she standing here, in front of Claire, glowing with that haunting, otherworldly light? "What happened to you?" Claire's voice trembled, but she refused to let fear completely overtake her. "You didn't come back. This is not you. This is something else." Marissa's smile faltered, just for a moment, before her eyes darkened, that same eerie glow intensifying. "No, Claire. This is me. This is what I've become. You'll see. You'll understand. Soon." The air around them seemed to thicken as the light pulsed with each of Marissa's words, growing stronger with each passing second. Claire could feel it deep in her chest, the pull, the urgency, the hunger. The woods hadn't just been a place of shadows and forgotten paths. It was a gateway, a place where something had waited, patient, ever since Marissa's death. And now it was reaching for her. Claire's legs trembled, but she refused to let herself collapse. "No, I won't be like you," she whispered, the words almost a vow, as if declaring it would somehow make it true. But Marissa's face softened, almost lovingly, as she stepped closer, the light surrounding her like a halo. "You already are," she said quietly, her voice as gentle as a breath of wind. "You've always been part of it, Claire. It was only a matter of time before you'd come back." The ground beneath Claire's feet seemed to tremble, a low rumble echoing in the distance, as though the earth itself was aware of the truth in Marissa's words. It was too late now. The light was pulling at her, and it wouldn't let go. Claire's heart raced. She had tried to escape it. She had run from the woods, from the thing that had marked her, but it had always been here, inside her, waiting. She could feel the truth now, burning in her chest, unraveling her. But she couldn't accept it. Not like this. Not when it felt like everything was slipping away, like she was losing herself piece by piece. "I won't become part of it," Claire spat, her voice trembling but defiant. "I won't let the light take me." Marissa's gaze softened for just a moment, and Claire thought she saw a flicker of something. Regret? But then it was gone, replaced by that same cold, distant look. The smile returned, but now it was empty. Void. "Then you'll never be free," Marissa said, almost sadly. "The light isn't something you can escape. It doesn't take you become. You always have been." The air around them grew colder, the light now blinding, wrapping around Claire like a shroud, pulling her in, suffocating her. Claire stumbled back again, her vision growing blurry as the light pressed closer, the hum of it vibrating in her bones. She could no longer tell where the world ended and the light began. It was in her head, in her soul. It was inside her. "Claire, listen to me." Marissa's voice broke through, almost like a whisper. "You've always been connected to this place, to the light. You can't outrun it anymore. You've crossed the line." Claire's heart pounded against her chest, and as she stood there, frozen in place, she could feel the last remnants of her resistance starting to crumble. The light felt alive. It was alive, and it was calling to her like a part of her own soul. She could feel it, crawling through her veins, weaving into her thoughts. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. No, she couldn't let this happen. But the light pulsed again, stronger now, filling her vision until there was nothing but white, blinding light. And then, as the world seemed to fall away, she heard Marissa's final words. "It's too late, Claire. The woods, they never let go." Claire blinked, her vision hazy, the world around her no longer solid, but a blur of bright light and shadow. Her senses felt disjointed, as if she were both present and not at the same time. Her body ached with an unfamiliar emptiness, and yet there was a warmth in her chest that spread like fire through her veins. It wasn't pain, no, it was something else, something alive. She lifted her hand, watching in disbelief as it glowed faintly, the light flickering like a pulse from deep inside her. It wasn't her own light, but something that had melded with her. The forest, though still unseen, was everywhere. She could feel it around her, beneath her feet, in the very air she breathed. She wasn't alone. There were others here, but they weren't human. Her breath caught in her throat as the light began to fade, the edges of her vision clearing. She was no longer standing in the middle of the road. The world had shifted, and she found herself in a place both familiar and strange. It was the forest, but not as she remembered it. The trees were darker, twisted in ways that made her spine crawl, the air thick and oppressive. The light, her light, still pulsed in her chest, now in sync with the beating of the trees around her. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, like the earth itself was breathing. There were voices, too, distant whispers that echoed through the space. So quiet at first she couldn't tell if they were her own thoughts or something else. But as she strained to listen, they became clearer. "Welcome home." Her heart stopped. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't Marissa. No, it wasn't Marissa at all. This voice was older, deeper, and filled with a weight that made the very air around her tremble. "Who? Who are you?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling, but she felt no fear, only the pull of something greater, something vast. A shadow shifted in front of her, rising from the roots of the twisted trees. Slowly, the shadow began to form into a shape, a figure, tall and elegant, its features hidden by the blur of light and shadow. "You've been marked," the figure said, its voice like a distant rumble. "The forest calls to you, and you have answered." The figure stepped closer, and Claire could make out more details. A long cloak of shifting darkness, eyes that burned with the intensity of forgotten stars. "The light. It is part of you now. You are its vessel. It has chosen you to take its place." The figure's eyes gleamed. "The old ones are waiting, and soon they will see what you have become." Claire's pulse quickened. The old ones? She had heard of them, the ancient entities that existed in the depths of the forest, the ones that the locals whispered about, the ones who had claimed Marissa, but she didn't understand. She didn't know what was happening to her. I don't understand. I'm not." She couldn't finish the thought. Her voice cracked as the realization hit her. She wasn't herself anymore. She had been changed. "Yes, child." The figure's smile was both terrifying and comforting. "You are part of them now, but it is not too late for you to embrace what you've become." Claire shook her head, her breath quickening. "No, I can't. I can't be like this. I don't want to be like her." The figure tilted its head, its form shifting like liquid darkness. "You already are. Marissa's fate was sealed long ago, but your fate, yours is still uncertain." It took a step closer, and Claire felt herself drawn to it, a magnetic force pulling her forward, urging her to accept what had happened. But she fought against it. No, she would not succumb to the forest, to this thing that was trying to claim her soul. I will fight it," Claire whispered, her voice strong despite the terror rising in her chest. The figure's eyes softened, just for a moment, before it straightened, the shadows around it deepening. "You may try, but remember, the forest never lets go." Suddenly, everything began to shake, the world around her bending and twisting like the light itself was alive, reaching for her, pulling her in. Her body screamed with the weight of it. But as the pressure built, a thought sparked in her mind, a single, terrifying thought. She wasn't just the light's vessel. She was becoming part of the forest. The old ones were inside her. She could feel their hunger, their cold, ancient power stirring within her, and the sensation made her want to scream. But she could only listen as the forest, the light, and the voice from the shadows seemed to draw closer, faster, until something snapped. The ground beneath Claire shifted violently, and a torrent of energy exploded out of her, the power of the forest surging through her veins. For a moment, everything went dark. And then, she was standing in the heart of the woods, but it was no longer the place she had known. The air was thick with magic, and all around her, the trees stretched impossibly high, their limbs twisting into strange, distorted shapes. The very earth seemed to hum with the energy of the light. It was as if she were standing in the center of the universe, connected to everything, a vessel of ancient power. She was one with the forest, but the terror didn't subside. No matter how much the light pulsed within her, no matter how much it tried to soothe her, the whispers from deep within the shadows were clear now. "You are mine." She closed her eyes, but she couldn't escape the words that filled her thoughts, the terrible certainty that she had been marked forever. She would never walk free again. Her body shook as the light grew stronger, and in that moment, Claire realized the full weight of the choice she had made. She had tried to escape it, tried to fight it, but she had failed. The forest had claimed her, and now it would never let her go. Claire's body trembled as the weight of the forest pressed down on her. Her heart pounded, and the light that pulsed within her was no longer warm. It was cold, unyielding. The whispers continued, louder now, echoing through her thoughts like a tide that had broken free of its shores. She wasn't alone here, not in this strange, twisted version of the woods. The trees themselves felt alive, their roots deep in the earth, their branches reaching out to her, pulling her into the very heart of this dark place. It was no longer just the light she felt, it was the forest, alive and breathing within her. "You are one now, Claire." The voice spoke again, deep and resonant, like the wind itself. "The forest has chosen you." Her head spun, the overwhelming presence of the forest too much to process. The trees around her seemed to bend inward, the shadows thickening as though the very air was thick with some kind of intangible force. Claire felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the earth itself warping as if it were alive. "No," she whispered, barely able to speak as the power within her surged again. "I won't be. I can't." "You have no choice," the voice interrupted, now a low, thunderous growl. "The light has claimed you. The old ones are waiting." The world around her seemed to shimmer, the edges of the trees warping into strange shapes. The shadows deepened and Claire's vision blurred. She could feel the cold presence of the old ones, ancient and untouchable, their power ancient and vast. She could feel their hunger, the darkness that hungered for her very soul. With all her strength, Claire forced herself to take a step back, but the earth beneath her feet shifted, locking her in place. She was rooted to the spot, bound by the ancient power of the forest. The light pulsed within her, making her skin tingle as though it were being branded. A whisper echoed in the darkness, a voice that was both ancient and familiar. It was the voice of Marissa. "Claire." Claire's pulse quickened at the sound of her name. She felt an inexplicable pull toward the voice, but this time, it wasn't out of longing. It was a warning. Marissa was lost to the forest. She had become something other, and Claire didn't want to follow in her footsteps. "Marissa?" Claire's voice shook as she tried to speak. "What happened to you? What did they do to you?" Marissa's voice, once soft and familiar, had become a part of the whispers that filled the space. It echoed around Claire, distant but clear. They gave me what I wanted, Claire. The forest doesn't lie. The light, it doesn't betray. But you are not like me. Not yet." Claire gritted her teeth, her mind whirling as she tried to understand. The forest had claimed Marissa, just as it was trying to claim her now. But there had to be a way out. There had to be some way to break the bond, to sever her connection to the light before it consumed her completely. "Please," Claire whispered, her heart aching. "Marissa, help me. Tell me how to stop this." The answer came, but it wasn't from Marissa. It came from deep within the forest, from the old ones themselves. "There is no escape, child." The voice of the forest intoned, its presence suffocating. "You are bound. The light is part of you now. It is in your blood, in your bones. You are ours." The ground trembled beneath Claire's feet, and for the first time, she felt herself being pulled into the earth. Her legs buckled beneath her, her body crumbling under the weight of the forest power. The trees seemed to move, their branches twisting and creaking, and Claire knew the old ones were watching. They were waiting for her to embrace them. Her thoughts spun wildly. She couldn't let them take her. She couldn't let them win. But the power inside her, this connection to the light and the forest, was growing stronger, the pressure building in her chest until it felt like she might shatter under its weight. Desperation clawed at her, and she closed her eyes, focusing on the light within her. She had to fight it. She had to find a way to push it back, to regain control. She wasn't going to let the forest consume her. With every ounce of willpower, she called out to the one person who might understand. The one person who had been lost here, who had felt this pull before. "Marissa, please!" Claire screamed, her voice raw with pain and desperation. "You were here. You know how to stop it. You have to help me." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the shadows shifted. A figure emerged from the dark, barely a shape at first, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. Claire's heart skipped a beat. It was Marissa, but not as Claire had remembered her. Her features were distorted, her eyes glowing with that eerie, unnatural light. Her skin was pale, her body ethereal, like something that had once been human but was no longer. Her smile was vacant, her eyes wide with the pull of the forest, the same pull that now gripped Claire. "You cannot fight the forest, Claire." Marissa's voice was soft, but it held a deep, unsettling truth. "You belong here. It's where you were always meant to be." "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "I won't become like you. I won't let it take me." Marissa's eyes seemed to soften for a moment, and for a brief, fleeting second, Claire saw something almost human in her gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold, hungry emptiness of the forest. "It's not about what you want anymore," Marissa said softly, her voice echoing like a memory. "It's about what the forest needs, and it needs you." Claire's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood frozen before Marissa, her mind spinning with confusion and terror. The forest, the light, the presence of the old ones, they were all closing in on her. Her body was trembling, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to make sense of the darkness that surrounded her. Marissa's face, though eerily calm, was no longer human. Her eyes glowed with that haunting, unnatural light, and her smile was thin, as though it had been carved into her skin. She was a specter of the forest, a thing that had long since surrendered to its pull. Claire could see it now, in every inch of her, a shadow of who she had once been, swallowed by the hunger of the forest. "You're already changing, Claire," Marissa whispered, her voice barely more than a sigh in the wind. "It's happening whether you want it to or not." Claire's hands shook, and for a moment, she felt like she might collapse under the weight of it all. The forest was alive with an energy she could hardly comprehend, its pulse thrumming through the very air, vibrating in her bones. She could feel the pull of it stronger now than ever before. It was inside her, a part of her, and she could feel the ancient hunger of the old ones wrapping around her soul, clawing at her from the inside. "No," Claire choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't be like you. I won't become a part of this." Marissa's expression softened for a fleeting moment, but there was no compassion in her eyes, only a distant, resigned emptiness. "You don't understand," Marissa said, shaking her head. "You never did. The forest isn't something that you can escape. You never could. You're tied to it, just as I am, just as we all are." Claire's chest tightened. "What are you saying? That I'm like you? That I'm..." Bound to the heart of the forest, Marissa finished for her, her voice distant. "Once you've been marked, there's no going back. The light, it's part of you now. You can't fight it forever." Claire's stomach churned as she glanced around at the forest, its oppressive weight pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel the eyes of the old ones on her now, their presence suffocating, their power more tangible than ever. She didn't want to become like Marissa. She didn't want to lose herself, to be swallowed whole by this place. But the light inside her, the one that burned deep in her chest, that thrummed with the pulse of the forest, was getting harder to ignore. It was calling to her. She could feel it drawing her in, pulling her toward the very heart of the woods, where the power of the old ones lay dormant, waiting. "No," Claire whispered fiercely, her fists clenched. "I won't give in. I won't let it take me." Marissa's eyes flickered with something akin to pity, but it was fleeting. She stepped closer, her ethereal presence growing more intense with every step. "You think you have a choice?" Marissa's voice was cold now, the words sharp as knives. "The forest chooses. It has already chosen you, Claire. You've already crossed the line." Claire stumbled back, her mind spinning with the horror of it all. She didn't know what was worse, the thought of becoming a part of this place, this twisted, living forest, or the idea that she had no control over her own fate. "What if I don't want this?" Claire cried, her voice raw with emotion. "What if I don't want to be like you?" "You already are, Claire," Marissa said softly, her voice almost a mournful whisper. "You've always been connected to it. The light has always been a part of you." A scream built in Claire's chest, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't let the fear overwhelm her. Not now. She couldn't give in. With every ounce of willpower she had left, Claire closed her eyes, focusing on the light inside her. It was a part of her now. There was no denying that. But maybe, just maybe, she could use it. She wasn't going to become another lost soul like Marissa. She wouldn't let herself be consumed. She pushed forward, her heart racing, her thoughts clear with a singular focus. She had to reach the heart of the forest, the place where the light had originated, the place where the old ones dwelled. As Claire began to move, she felt the ground beneath her tremble, and the trees around her seemed to close in, their branches reaching for her, trying to hold her back. The whispers grew louder, like a deafening chorus in her mind, urging her to stop, to give in. But Claire pushed forward, ignoring the voices, ignoring the pull of the forest. She was stronger than this. She had to be. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the heart of the woods. The trees were taller here, their twisted limbs intertwining in unnatural ways, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The light inside her burned hotter now, its pulse quickening with every step she took. And then she saw it. At the center of the forest stood a massive, ancient tree, its bark twisted and gnarled, its roots sinking deep into the earth. The light emanated from it, pulsing like a heartbeat, calling to her, begging her to come closer. This was it, the heart of the forest. But as Claire stepped closer, something changed. The light that had once seemed comforting now felt oppressive, suffocating. It was no longer just a part of her. It was consuming her, wrapping around her soul, and she could feel the power of the old one stirring inside her, urging her to surrender. Her hands trembled, and she fell to her knees, the weight of the forest crashing down on her, pushing her deeper into the earth. The whispers filled her ears, louder now, demanding her to accept. Claire's heart raced as she fought against it, her body screaming in protest. But the power of the forest was overwhelming, and she felt herself slipping into the darkness. "Claire!" It was Marissa's voice again, but this time, there was no pity, no sadness, only the cold, empty embrace of the forest. And Claire knew, with chilling certainty, that she was no longer in control. Claire's mind swam in a haze of conflicting emotions. The pull of the forest was undeniable, its ancient power wrapping around her with such intensity that she felt as though her very soul were being drawn into the ground beneath her. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent, urging her to surrender, to become one with the forest, to accept the eternal embrace of the old ones. But deep inside her, there was a spark of resistance, a single, fragile thread of clarity that refused to be consumed by the darkness. "You don't have to do this, Claire." Marissa's voice echoed in her ears, this time softer, almost pleading. "It's not too late. You can still join us. You can still belong." The words should have been comforting, but they felt like nails dragging across Claire's skin. She had heard them before, back in the depths of the forest when Marissa had first tried to draw her in. And each time, they had only made her more determined to fight, to hold on to what little humanity she had left. Claire struggled to move, her body heavy and uncooperative, as if the earth itself were trying to keep her grounded. The light within her pulsed, and she could feel it crawling beneath her skin, seeping into her veins, making her feel as though she were suffocating from the inside out. The ancient tree loomed before her, its bark twisted and dark, veins of light running through it like blood pulsing through an artery. The air was thick with the energy of the forest, the weight of the old ones pressing down on her from all sides. Claire's breath was shallow, her chest constricting as if something were tightening around her heart. In the distance, she saw the figures of Marissa and the others, the lost souls of the forest. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty and distant, their bodies pale and gone. They had been claimed by the forest, their humanity stripped away, and now they wandered its depths as mere shadows, nothing more than puppets to the will of the old ones. "You could have it all, Claire," Marissa's voice continued, but now it was no longer the voice of the friend she had once known. It was hollow, empty, and full of a terrible yearning. The power, the eternity, all you have to do is give in. Claire closed her eyes, her head spinning as the words tried to burrow into her mind. She could feel the pressure building, the hunger of the forest pulling at her, but she fought against it, every fiber of her being screaming in protest. She wasn't like them. She wasn't going to let the forest claim her. Her hands clenched into fists, the light inside her flickering in response. She could feel it, the choice. It was hers to make. She could either let the forest consume her, or she could try to break free. She could either become the forest, or she could fight against it. And she knew, deep down, what she had to do. With a strength that she didn't know she still had, Claire forced herself to her feet. Her body screamed in protest, her muscles aching, but she stood tall, her eyes fixed on the ancient tree that loomed before her, its twisted branches reaching out like fingers, like claws. The forest was old, older than anything Claire could comprehend. It was full of ancient magic, full of dark power, and it wanted her. But she would not give in. "I am not yours," Claire whispered, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not be yours." The light within her pulsed brighter, pushing back against the oppressive darkness of the forest. For the briefest moment, Claire felt a flicker of warmth, a light that she could almost touch. And then, with a single breath, she stepped forward. The world seemed to tilt as the forest reacted, its power surging in response. The ground beneath Claire's feet trembled, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with energy. The light inside her surged as well, responding to the pull of the old ones. But this time, it didn't feel like suffocating darkness. It felt like freedom, like a spark of defiance that was too strong to extinguish. The ancient tree seemed to recoil, the light within it dimming, flickering in a way that was almost uncertain. "No!" the forest roared, its voice like thunder in her mind. The very air around her seemed to crackle with fury. "You cannot defy us. You are ours." But Claire stood her ground. Her heart beat in time with the pulse of the forest. And for the first time, she felt the light inside her pushing against the darkness, not with the weight of despair, but with the strength of defiance. She wasn't part of the forest. She was human, and she would not become another lost soul. "I am not yours." The forest screamed again, but Claire didn't flinch. The light within her swelled, growing brighter, more intense, until it flooded her entire being, filling every corner of her mind, her body, her soul. The light wasn't just power, it was her will, and she would not be consumed. In a flash of brilliant light, Claire felt the power of the forest shudder, the earth beneath her feet crumbling, the trees groaning in protest as the forest recoiled from her. She could feel the pull of the old ones, their hunger, their fury, but it was weakening. Their hold on her was slipping. And then with a single final surge, Claire broke free. The forest went silent. Claire fell to her knees, gasping for air, her body shaking as the last remnants of the light within her faded. She had done it. She had fought the forest, and she had won. For now. But the cost had been high. She could still feel the lingering presence of the forest, the touch of the old ones in the back of her mind, like a shadow that would never quite fade. She had won, but she knew the forest would come for her again. She had only bought herself time. Claire looked around at the clearing, the twisted trees, the dark earth. The light that had once felt like a beacon was now a flicker, weak and fading, but still alive, still hers. And she knew, deep in her soul, that she was not free. But for now, she was alive. Claire stood in the clearing, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the battle she had just fought. The forest was still, unnervingly so, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. The eerie silence that now filled the air was a stark contrast to the thundering pulse of power that had once filled this space. The light inside her still flickering weakly, but alive. She could feel it, the mark. It was there, deep within her, like a brand that would never fade. The forest had left its imprint on her, a stain on her soul that would follow her wherever she went. Even now, she could feel the weight of its hunger, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness, reminding her that she had not truly escaped. It was only a matter of time before the forest came for her again. The faint rustle of leaves reached her ears, and Claire turned sharply, her heart racing. For a brief moment, she thought she might be hallucinating, her mind playing tricks on her after the battle. But no, there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. Marissa. The light in her eyes had dimmed. She no longer had that otherworldly glow, the eerie radiance that had made her seem like something less than human. Instead, her expression was vacant, her once vibrant features now gaunt and weary. She looked like someone who had been starved for years, as though the forest had already begun to consume her from the inside out. Claire, Marissa's voice was weak, raspy, but still filled with a desperate, pleading tone. You've done it. You've broken free. Claire's pulse quickened as she took a cautious step forward. I didn't mean to hurt you, Marissa, but I had no choice. I had to get out. Marissa's eyes were empty, but there was a flicker of something in them, a shadow of the person she used to be. Her lips trembled as she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. No, you've done what none of us could. You've fought back, but the forest doesn't let go so easily. Claire swallowed hard, her throat tight. What do you mean? You're not like the others, are you? You're still you. Marissa gave a small, bitter laugh, but it lacked any real humor. I was never truly me, Claire. Not anymore. The force takes over piece by piece. Slowly. You can fight it, but the price is high. You can never truly leave it. I thought I was strong enough to resist, but the forest is stronger than you think. Stronger than I ever understood. Claire took another step toward her, the weight of Marissa's words sinking in. She felt the distant echo of the forest call within her, a growing pressure in the back of her mind. The more she tried to push it away, the stronger it seemed to grow. The forest hadn't given up on her. It was simply waiting, biding its time. Marissa's eyes were filled with an old sadness, one that Claire knew she couldn't fully understand. Not yet. She reached out a trembling hand, and Claire hesitated before grasping it. The coldness of her touch sent a shiver through Claire's spine. Get out, Marissa whispered. While you can, the light will keep calling you back. You can't outrun it forever. The words hung heavy in the air, but Claire wasn't sure what they meant. She wasn't sure she could ever outrun the forest. It was a part of her now, its light, its power. It was all entwined with her being. But she wouldn't give up. Not yet. I'll fight it, Claire said, her voice more confident than she felt. I won't let it consume me. I won't become one of them. Marissa nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around Claire's hand, as if she was trying to hold on to the last shreds of something long lost. You have more strength than I ever had. But remember, every time you resist, it will fight back harder. The forest doesn't forgive. As Marissa pulled away from Claire, the forest seemed to respond, the trees groaning in the distance, as if beckoning her to stay. Marissa glanced toward the shadows and then back at Claire, her expression filled with a quiet resignation. Go, before it's too late, Marissa whispered, her voice breaking. Save yourself. Claire didn't need to hear anymore. She turned, running through the clearing and deeper into the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she could truly outrun the forest, but she had to try. The path ahead of her was unclear, the trees towering above her as the forest seemed to close in. Every step she took was met with the oppressive weight of the ancient magic that lingered in the air. But this time, she didn't feel the all-consuming pull. This time, she felt free, at least for now. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself harder, deeper into the forest. She didn't look back, but she could feel it, the forest, the presence of the old ones, their hunger, their watchful eyes upon her. They were waiting for her to slip up, to show weakness, to give in. But she wasn't ready to give up. She wasn't going to let them win. Somewhere in the distance, a faint light flickered on the horizon, a reminder of the hope that still burned within her. A reminder that, despite everything, Claire still had a choice. The days following Claire's escape from the heart of the forest were strange. She could feel the forest's presence lingering, its energy brushing against her every time she closed her eyes. The light that had once been a beacon of warmth and safety now felt like a curse, a constant reminder that no matter how far she ran, the forest was still watching. But there was no turning back. Claire knew that now. The forest would never let go completely. The only thing she could do was keep moving forward. And she had learned something in the heart of the woods. She had learned that the forest could be fought. The battle might never end, but she could fight. She could resist. As Claire ventured further into the unknown, she felt an old, familiar pull. She didn't know if it was the forest or the light within her, but the fear in her chest began to rise again. But she wasn't alone, and she wouldn't let the forest win. The days blurred into one another as Claire wandered through the dense forest. The trees stretched overhead like towering sentinels, their branches intertwining in a canopy that blocked out the sun. The world around her seemed to grow darker, colder, each step heavier than the last. Every sound she heard, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, felt like a whisper from the forest itself, an unseen force that was always just a step behind her. She hadn't seen Marissa since that final moment in the clearing, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that her friend was still out there, somewhere in the depths of the woods. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before, but Claire wasn't ready to believe that Marissa was lost forever. She had fought the forest, and she knew Marissa still had that fight within her. Somewhere deep inside, the light that had once connected them was still there, flickering weakly but alive. But for now, Claire could do nothing but move forward. Her muscles ached from the constant travel, and her mind was growing weary from the constant battle to suppress the voice of the forest that whispered in the back of her mind. The forest had a way of infiltrating the mind, playing tricks on a person's sanity. She had seen it happen to the others, people who had once wandered into the woods with no ill intentions, only to lose themselves to the whispers, the promises of eternal peace, of belonging. And as the days wore on, Claire couldn't help but feel the creeping pull of the forest, tugging at her thoughts, urging her to stop, to give in, to let go. But she resisted, holding on to the memory of the light, the hope that she could still win. On the seventh day, the whispers became louder. They weren't just in her mind anymore. They were all around her, seeping through the trees, carried on the wind. The words were unintelligible, but they felt like a presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Claire paused, her breath catching in her throat as she turned in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The trees around her were tall and imposing, their bark dark and thick, twisting in unnatural shapes, and the shadows between them seemed to stretch farther than they should. She was being watched, and she knew it wasn't just the forest. It was the old ones. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as the whispers intensified, growing clearer, louder. It was as though the forest itself was speaking to her, trying to draw her back, to reclaim what it had lost. She could feel the heat of the light inside her flickering once more, responding to the call. But Claire refused to listen. She had no choice now but to keep moving. But the forest was relentless. It began to close in around her, the trees bending in strange, unnatural ways as though they were reaching for her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, becoming soft and unstable, as though it, too, were alive. The very air felt thick, suffocating, and the forest seemed to hum with energy, the whispers becoming maddening. Claire stumbled forward, pushing her way through the underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The pull of the forest was too strong to ignore. It was as though her feet were being drawn toward a specific point, a clearing, a place of power. But as she stepped into the clearing, the air around her froze. She wasn't alone. Standing in the center of the clearing, bathed in a pale, eerie light, was a figure. A woman. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the pale, gaunt features, the eyes that were once filled with light now hollow and distant. It was Marissa. But something was wrong. Marissa's presence felt wrong. She was no longer the friend Claire had known. The woman before her was something different, something changed. Marissa, Claire's voice trembled, her hand instinctively reaching out as if she could draw her back into the light. But the figure did not move. It stood motionless, its gaze fixed on Claire with a strange, unreadable expression. The whispers around Claire grew louder, and the air grew colder. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the forest closed in tighter, pressing in on all sides. Marissa's lips parted, but her voice was not her own. The words that came out were alien, distorted, as though the forest itself was speaking through her. "You were always meant to be here, Claire." The words froze Claire's blood in her veins. The voice was so much darker, filled with a weight of ancient power. The old ones, they had come for her, and Marissa was their vessel. "You don't belong in the world you came from. You belong to us." Claire's eyes widened in horror, her heart racing as she realized the truth. Marissa wasn't just a victim of the forest. She had become it. She was now a part of the old ones, their puppet, their chosen one. The realization hit Claire like a wave, but she quickly pushed it aside. She couldn't give in. Not now. "No," Claire whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to engulf her. "I'm not like you. I won't become one of them." Marissa's expression twisted into something unreadable. A dark shadow seemed to flicker behind her eyes as she stepped forward, her movements unnatural, like something puppet-like. "You are already one of us, Claire. It's just a matter of time." Before Claire could react, Marissa extended her hand, and the earth beneath Claire's feet cracked open, roots rising from the ground like tendrils, reaching toward her. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and Claire could feel the forest pushing against her, trying to draw her in, to reclaim what it had lost. The light inside her flared. Claire dug her heels into the ground, fighting the pull of the forest. She could feel the power of the old ones pushing against her, their hunger reaching out through Marissa's words, through the very air around her. The light inside her burned brighter, her heart beating faster as she fought with everything she had. "I won't let you win," Claire cried, her voice filled with defiance. "You don't control me." With every ounce of strength, Claire focused on the light inside her, channeling it, pushing back against the suffocating force of the forest. She could feel the pull of the darkness, the weight of the old ones, but she refused to give in. Her light was hers, and she would not let it fade. The ground trembled beneath her feet as the ancient power of the forest collided with the force of the light. Claire's heart raced, the energy inside her a volatile storm, but she held on, refusing to let go. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The forest seemed to exhale. The roots pulled back, retreating into the ground. The whispers faded into the distance. And Marissa was gone. Claire stood in the center of the clearing, breathing heavily, her body trembling from the force of the struggle. Her chest heaved as she fought to regain control of her racing heart. But as the silence stretched on, she knew one thing for certain. The forest hadn't given up. It was just waiting for its next opportunity. Claire's steps faltered as she continued her trek through the dense, unyielding forest. Every direction seemed indistinguishable from the last. The trees, those towering, gnarled sentinels of the old ones, loomed above her with their heavy branches, blocking out the sky. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with a quiet, almost malevolent energy. The light inside her was flickering again, its warmth slowly being drained by the surrounding darkness. It was a battle now, one that Claire felt in every fiber of her being. The forest was always there, always watching, always waiting for her to slip. She could no longer trust her senses. The forest was too deceptive. Even now, the landscape seemed to shift before her eyes. Paths that weren't there before, shadows that didn't quite belong, whispers in the wind. Claire tried not to listen to them, though the pressure of their call was almost overwhelming. Still, she refused to look back. There was no time for hesitation. The old ones had shown their hand with Marissa, and the price of her survival was yet to be paid. Claire had no illusions about the forces that were closing in on her, but she couldn't let fear control her. The forest had already taken too much. Suddenly, the air felt different. A strange coldness settled in her chest, and the light inside her surged for a split second, burning brightly. Claire stopped in her tracks, eyes scanning the space ahead. Something was wrong. A presence, unfamiliar yet foreboding, was lingering in the shadows. She wasn't alone. A low rustle came from behind a cluster of thick, tangled roots ahead. The trees seemed to lean toward her, as if urging her forward, nudging her closer to whatever was hidden there. The whispers had quieted, leaving only the eerie, quiet waiting. A figure emerged from the shadows, draped in a cloak of tattered fabric. It moved slowly at first, as if unsure of Claire's response. Claire tensed, instinctively shifting into a defensive posture, but she didn't draw her weapon. Not yet. The figure's head was tilted down, its face obscured by the hood, but the overwhelming sensation of power that radiated from them was undeniable. Claire could feel it deep within her bones. This was no ordinary person. This was a force of the forest itself. The figure's voice, when it came, was a rasping whisper, cold and ancient. "You are more than they told me. I knew you would come." Claire's pulse quickened as she took a step back, eyeing the figure warily. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure gave a soft, eerie chuckle, the sound carrying through the silence like a brittle wind. "I'm one of the Watchers. I am the keeper of the boundary, the one who guards the place where the forest and the light meet. I was bound to this place long ago, but I can feel it. You are different." Claire narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" The figure stepped closer, revealing just enough of its face. The eyes were dark, completely black, hollow like empty voids, and they bore into Claire with an unsettling intensity. "It means you are not like the others who came before you. You are not a victim of the forest. You are a bridge between it and the world beyond." Claire's throat tightened. This wasn't just a figure in the woods. This was one of the keepers, an ancient entity bound to the forest's will. "I don't want to be a bridge," Claire said, her voice sharp. "I want to leave." The keeper's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though it was no smile at all. It was a grimace. "Oh, but you cannot. You see, the forest does not allow escape. It will always pull you back. It is part of you now, just as you were part of it." "Not yet," Claire retorted, stepping forward, defiance burning in her eyes. "I'll fight it. I'll find a way to destroy it." The keeper tilted its head to one side. "You misunderstand. You cannot destroy what was never meant to be destroyed. The forest is eternal. It is alive in ways you cannot comprehend. Even if you manage to defy it, the price will always be yours to pay." A deep unease crept over Claire. She felt the pressure of its gaze, the weight of its words. The forest's influence was growing stronger, and it was not just in the air, but in her, inside her. But she wasn't ready to give up. "Not now. I'll find a way," Claire repeated, more to herself than to the keeper. "I won't let it take me." The keeper's laugh was dry, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Perhaps you will, or perhaps you'll become one with it, as all the others have." Before Claire could respond, the keeper's form began to dissolve into the shadows, fading into the air like mist. It didn't retreat, it just vanished. For a long moment, Claire stood alone in the clearing, her heart racing. The forest felt different now, heavier, more oppressive. The light within her throbbed weakly, as if trying to shield her from the force that was closing in. The keeper's warning echoed in her mind. You are a bridge. A bridge. Claire's fingers trembled as she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the beat of her own heart mingling with the pulse of the forest. It was as if her very being was tied to it now, tethered to the land, to the light, to the darkness. She couldn't escape. She knew that, but neither would she surrender. There was still hope. She just had to find it. Claire's journey through the forest was becoming more treacherous. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent, pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel the pull of the old ones, their hunger, their reach, but she also felt something else, a stirring deep within her, something beyond the forest's grasp. The light. It wasn't gone yet. It wasn't finished. But the forest was relentless. It would fight back with everything it had. On the 10th day of her journey, she came upon a clearing unlike any she had seen before. In the center stood a great stone altar, cracked and weathered by the centuries. The air around it felt thick, saturated with power, and the light in Claire's chest surged in response, urging her forward. She had no choice now but to approach. As she stepped closer, the stone seemed to hum beneath her feet, resonating with the force that lay in the earth. The altar was marked with strange runes, symbols that pulsed with a faint, eerie light. And as Claire reached out to touch the stone's surface, the ground beneath her shifted. Something was awakening, and she knew this was where it would all come to a head. The moment Claire's fingertips brushed the surface of the ancient altar, a surge of energy shot through her, sharp and cold like ice slicing through her veins. The forest around her seemed to react, the trees groaning as if waking from a deep slumber. The whispers, those insidious, ever-present voices, escalated into a cacophony, and Claire's mind swam with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. For a brief moment, she felt like she was being pulled into the altar itself, into its stone, into the earth, into the very heart of the forest. The light inside her flared with such intensity that it burned at her skin, and she gasped, fighting to hold on to herself. The energy was overwhelming, but she refused to let go. Not now, not ever. With all the strength she could muster, Claire yanked her hand away, stumbling back from the altar. She blinked hard, trying to clear the dizziness from her mind, trying to reorient herself. The air was thick now, as if the very fabric of the world had shifted. The whispers had fallen silent, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground beneath her. Before her, the altar trembled, and the symbols etched into its surface began to glow faintly, pulsing with a dark, malignant light. Something ancient was awakening, something bound by time and magic, and it was drawing closer, its power rippling through the very earth. Claire's heart pounded as she looked around. The trees, once towering and ominous, now seemed to lean in toward her, their branches like hands reaching out to claim her. She could hear something stirring behind her, something unnatural. It wasn't just a forest, it was something else, something older. In the distance, beyond the clearing, the forest seemed to part for a moment, as though allowing her to see into the deep shadows. There, standing on the edge of the woods, was a figure, a man, or something that had once been a man, draped in a cloak as dark as night itself. His eyes, glowing an unsettling shade of amber, locked onto hers from across the clearing, and for a moment, she was paralyzed by his gaze. The figure raised a hand, and the earth trembled once more. The whispers returned, sharper this time. Claire's head swam with voices, promises of eternal peace, of power, of a place within the ancient fold of the forest, if only she would surrender. But she wasn't fooled. She knew these were lies. She'd heard them before, from Marissa, from the keeper. The forest didn't offer peace. It demanded submission. I won't give in, Claire muttered to herself, forcing her legs to move. She could still feel the pull of the light inside her, a fragile, flickering flame. She needed to keep that flame alive. She had to. The figure began to move toward her, slow and deliberate, its feet barely touching the ground as if it hovered just above the earth. The closer it came, the heavier the air became, thick and suffocating, pressing down on her chest like a vice. The whispers were deafening now, clawing at her sanity, threatening to drown her in their dark promises. The man, or whatever it was, stopped just beyond the altar, his eyes never leaving hers. A cold smile spread across his face, stretching too wide, too unnaturally. You think you can defy us? His voice was deep, resonating with an ancient, terrible power that rattled the bones. The force calls to you, Claire. You are its now. No, Claire gasped, shaking her head violently. I'm not yours. I will never be yours. The figure tilted its head, his smile twisting into something more sinister. You're already one of us. The light inside you. It is ours to take. We are the keepers, the eternal ones, the guardians of the boundaries. And you, Claire, are the key. You will open the way for us. Claire's heart raced as she stumbled back, her hands instinctively reaching for anything she could use. The forest was closing in on her again, its tendrils of dark magic wrapping around her, drawing her toward the altar. But she couldn't give up. She wouldn't. No, she whispered, gathering what little strength she had left. I'll fight. I'll destroy you if it's the last thing I do. The figure's laugh echoed around her, sending chills down her spine. You cannot fight what is already inside you. The old ones are eternal. They are here, in the shadows and the light. You cannot escape them, Claire. You cannot run from us. Suddenly, the earth beneath her feet cracked open with a violent roar, and Claire fell to her knees as the ground trembled violently. The altar pulsed with more energy, glowing with a sickly green hue, and a dark mist began to swirl around her. Claire felt the light inside her weakening, flickering like a dying ember. She couldn't let go, but the forest was too strong, the darkness too overwhelming. The figure stepped forward, its presence looming over her as the shadows pressed in on all sides. The whispers became louder, more insistent, until they drowned out everything else. Given Claire, embrace the forest. The light inside her flared suddenly, brighter than it had ever been, burning through the darkness. Claire gasped, feeling the energy surge through her, and she pushed herself to her feet, shaking with the effort. She couldn't let it go out. She couldn't let the forest win. The figure raised its hand, and the air around Claire seemed to freeze, the world holding its breath. The mist grew thicker, and Claire's vision began to blur. The light inside her flickered again, and for a moment, she thought it might be extinguished completely. But then, something changed. Deep within her, Claire felt a spark, small, fragile, but undeniable. It was the will to fight, a part of her that refused to surrender. Her heart beat with it, and the light surged once more, not as a weak flicker, but as a blaze. You cannot have me. The words escaped her lips before she could stop them, and with them came a force unlike anything she had ever felt. The light within her radiated outward, filling the clearing with its pure energy, pushing back against the darkness. The figure reeled back, its face contorted in rage as it raised its hands to shield itself from the light. But the power of the forest and the old ones was no match for the strength of Claire's determination. The forest seemed to roar in fury, but it was the light that won. With a final, blinding flash, Claire's light engulfed everything around her. The ground beneath her trembled, and the trees seemed to shudder in the wake of the explosion of energy. For a moment, everything was silent, as if the very forest held its breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. Claire stood alone in the clearing, gasping for breath, the remnants of the light flickering weakly within her. The forest was still, unnaturally still. The figure, the keeper, the altar. Everything had vanished. But Claire knew this wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. The forest had been momentarily silenced, but it was still out there, waiting, watching. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. Claire stood alone in the clearing, the aftermath of her confrontation with the keeper settling like dust in the air. The light that had once surged through her now flickered weakly, as if exhausted by the battle. But there was a fierce, unyielding resolve in her heart. She knew the danger wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The forest had quieted, but it wasn't the peaceful stillness of a calm night. No, this silence felt different, unnatural. The trees no longer towered over her in ominous shadows. They seemed to lean in, listening, waiting for the next move. The ground beneath her felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that made her skin crawl. Claire took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she gripped the strap of her satchel. There had to be something more, something she was missing. She couldn't let the forest reclaim her now. It had already taken so much, and it wouldn't take any more. But the truth loomed over her, heavy and oppressive. The forest wasn't something that could be fought and defeated. It was ancient, eternal, its roots dug deep into the earth, into the very fabric of the world. No matter how hard she fought, it would always find a way to pull her back. You can't fight what is already part of you. The words of the keeper echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the truth she'd tried to deny. The forest wasn't just something that had invaded her life. It was inside her now. It had left its mark, deep and irrevocable. The light within her pulsed with a strange new rhythm, one she hadn't felt before. Something had changed, something deep within her that she couldn't explain. As Claire took a step forward, her boots crunching on the brittle ground, she felt the weight of the forest's size on her. Every step she took seemed to reverberate through the trees. Every movement watched and calculated. It was as if the forest itself were testing her, pushing her to her limits. A flicker of light to her left caught her attention, and Claire whirled around, heart hammering in her chest. Her hand instinctively reached for the weapon she'd been carrying, but there was no sign of danger. The source of the light was not a figure, not a person, but a shimmering aura, hanging like a wisp in the air. It pulsed softly, faintly, like the last ember of a dying flame. Despite her better judgment, Claire moved toward it. As she drew closer, the light flared briefly, illuminating a path that had been hidden from view, a narrow trail winding deeper into the heart of the forest. It was as if the light itself were beckoning her, urging her forward. Claire hesitated for only a moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to escape while she still could. But deep within her, she knew that this path held the answers she needed. The forest, the keepers, the light inside her, all of it was leading her here. She couldn't ignore it. She stepped onto the path, the light from the aura guiding her every movement, its soft glow barely enough to see by. The air grew colder as she moved deeper, and the silence pressed in on her once more, thick and suffocating. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining, creating a canopy that blocked out the sky above. The path twisted and turned, but Claire didn't question it. She had to keep moving, had to keep following the light. It was the only thing that felt certain in this place of shadows. After what felt like hours, Claire stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood another altar, even more ancient than the one she had encountered before. It was covered in moss and vines, the stone crumbling beneath the weight of centuries. But there was something else, something that caught her attention immediately. A figure stood before the altar. At first, Claire thought it was the same figure she had seen before, the cloaked one with the glowing amber eyes, but as she got closer, she realized that this was someone different, someone familiar. Emily, Claire whispered, her heart skipping a beat. Emily stood at the altar, her back to Claire, her long hair tangled and wild, her shoulders slumped as if weighed down by an unseen burden. The light in the clearing flickered in strange patterns, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally. Emily, Claire repeated, taking a cautious step forward. What are you doing here? We need to leave. This place. But before she could finish, Emily turned slowly, her eyes wide and unblinking, as though she hadn't heard her. But there was something wrong. The look in her eyes was vacant, distant, empty. And then Claire saw it. The same light that had once burned within her now burned within Emily. It wasn't the soft, gentle glow of the forest magic, but something darker, more powerful. It was as if Emily had become a vessel for something far older than the forest itself. No, 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 Claire gasped, her chest tightening. Emily, what have they done to you? Emily didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand toward the altar, her movements slow and deliberate. The light within her intensified, swirling around her like a vortex. Claire could feel the energy radiating from her, the raw power of the forest and the old ones combining into something that felt alive, something unstoppable. And then, with a sudden, sharp motion, Emily slammed her palm down onto the altar. The ground beneath Claire's feet trembled, and the clearing was filled with a low, haunting hum. The air grew thick with magic, ancient, powerful, and terrifying. Claire's heart raced as she realized what was happening. Emily wasn't just here to find answers. She was here to unlock something that could not be undone. No, Claire shouted, rushing forward. Emily, stop! But it was too late. With a blinding flash of light, the altar exploded in a burst of energy, and the ground beneath them cracked open. The forest trembled, the trees groaning as though in pain, and the air became charged with a dark, oppressive force. Claire staggered back, shielding her eyes from the light, but the energy was overwhelming. The ground shook, and the clearing seemed to collapse inward, the forest around her bending and warping in ways that defied nature. And at the center of it all, Emily stood, her body glowing with the light of the old ones. Claire's mind raced, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she feared she had lost her. But then, through the blinding light, Claire saw something else, a shadow, a presence. It was watching her, waiting. The old ones were coming. The ground beneath Claire's feet continued to tremble, and the air grew thick with the power of the altar. The trees around her groaned in protest, their branches twisting unnaturally, as though trying to escape from the force that was swelling at the center of the clearing. The entire forest seemed to pulse with energy, its heart beating in time with the chaos now unfolding. Claire's chest tightened as she watched Emily. The light around her was no longer just a soft glow. It had become a storm of energy, swirling with an intensity that made the very air seem to crackle. Emily stood in the center of it, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were no longer truly aware of her surroundings. Emily, Claire shouted, her voice hoarse. Please, you have to stop. This isn't you. But Emily didn't respond. Her hand, still pressed firmly against the altar, glowed brighter with each passing second. The humming of the altar intensified, filling the clearing with a low, eerie vibration that seemed to echo in Claire's bones. The ground beneath her feet began to split, the earth cracking open with a deafening roar. Claire stumbled back, her heart pounding as she fought to maintain her balance. She could feel the power building, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. The forest around her was alive, thrumming with the presence of something ancient, something otherworldly. And then, with a terrible, final sound, the earth beneath them cracked open completely. The light around Emily flared one last time, and Claire shielded her eyes from the blinding brilliance. When she opened them again, the clearing had changed. The forest itself had shifted, its once familiar shape now unrecognizable. The trees had become twisted, their bark dark and gnarled, their branches reaching out like clawed hands. The sky above had turned an unnatural shade of black, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. At the center of it all, Emily was no longer the same person Claire had known. The light around her had merged with the darkness, twisting into a swirling vortex of energy that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. And then Claire saw them. Figures, tall and shrouded in shadows, emerged from the rift in the ground. Their forms were blurred, their features indistinct, but the presence they exuded was suffocating. They were ancient, older than the forest itself, their power palpable in the air. Claire could feel their gaze on her, even though their faces were hidden in shadow. The old ones. Emily's body trembled, her head tilting back as the energy within her surged to its peak. The vortex of light and shadow around her writhed like a living thing, and the air was filled with the oppressive weight of their power. Claire's breath hitched in her chest as she realized the truth. Emily hadn't just unlocked something within the forest. She had opened the door to the old ones, and now they were here. "Emily," Claire whispered, her voice barely a breath in the midst of the chaos. "Please come back to me." But Emily didn't respond. She was no longer the person Claire had once known. She was a vessel, an instrument for something far darker, far more dangerous. The figures, the old ones, moved closer, their presence growing stronger with every step. Claire could feel their power, their cold indifference, washing over her like a wave of ice. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the ground, her mind spinning with terror and disbelief. She had to act. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let them take Emily. Claire gritted her teeth, pushing herself to her feet. The light within her, the same light that had fought against the darkness before, was still there, flickering weakly. It wasn't gone yet. It wasn't too late. With trembling hands, Claire reached into her satchel, pulling out the ancient tome, the one she had found in the library. The pages were old and fragile, but she knew the power contained within them. She had studied the rituals, the symbols, the incantations. She had learned the ways to counteract the magic of the forest, to banish the old ones back into the darkness from which they came. But would it be enough? She didn't have time to think. The old ones were closing in, their shadowy forms becoming clearer, their features more distinct. They were tall, taller than any human, and their eyes, when they opened, glowed with a sickly, unearthly light. Their voices, when they spoke, echoed in Claire's mind, sending shivers down her spine. "You cannot stop us," one of them whispered. Its voice was like the rustling of dead leaves, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The forest is ours. You are ours." But Claire refused to listen. She forced herself to focus, to shut out the whispers that threatened to overwhelm her. She opened the tome and began to chant, the ancient words coming to her with a force she didn't fully understand. The language was foreign, but the meaning was clear. She called upon the forces of light, of balance, of the earth itself, to fight against the darkness of the old ones. Her voice rang out, steady and strong, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. As she spoke the words, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air grew colder. The light within her flared once more, brighter and more intense than ever before. It fought against the dark presence of the old ones, pushing back against their influence. But they were not easily defeated. The old ones raised their hands, and the sky above Claire darkened further. The trees around her groaned in agony, their bark splitting and cracking as if the forest itself were being torn apart. "No!" Claire cried, her voice rising above the chaos. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let Emily be lost forever. With all the strength she could muster, Claire took a step forward, forcing the light within her to surge. The power was almost too much to contain, but she refused to falter. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Emily, for the forest, for the very balance of the world. The old ones howled in fury, their forms twisting in the light. But Claire didn't stop. She pushed harder, her voice growing louder, more forceful. The energy around her exploded, a brilliant flash of light that cut through the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent, and then the darkness began to recede. For a moment, everything hung in the air, silent, still, as if the world itself had taken a collective breath. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as the blinding light filled the clearing, and she dared not move, lest she break the fragile silence. The old ones, their twisted, shadowed forms, began to waver, their powerful, ethereal presence flickering in and out of existence. The air around them shimmered, like a mirage on the edge of reality. They were weakening. The light was pushing them back. But Emily stood in the center of it all, unmoving, her body now a conduit for both the light and the darkness. Claire could see the struggle within her face twisted in pain, her eyes wide and unfocused as if trapped between two worlds. The energy within her was chaotic, wild. Neither the forest magic nor the ancient power of the Old Ones could completely control it. It surged and pulsed with every breath she took. "Emily," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "Come back. I know you're still in there. You have to fight this. I need you." For a split second, Emily's eyes seemed to flicker with recognition, as though she had heard Claire's voice. But then the light around her flared, drowning out everything. The ground beneath them cracked once more, this time in a violent burst, and the forest began to scream. The trees bent unnaturally, their trunks cracking with a deafening sound as if they were alive and in pain. The wind picked up, a howling force that tore at Claire's clothes and whipped her hair around her face. The clearing was becoming a battlefield, magic clashing with magic, light with darkness, both forces fighting for dominance. Claire's knees trembled with the weight of it all. She had come so far, had fought so hard, but this battle wasn't over. The Old Ones were not easy to banish, and the forest, it seemed, was determined to keep its grip on Emily. She couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not after everything. "Fight, Emily," Claire called, her voice breaking through the chaos. "You're stronger than this. You are the light." But Emily's body trembled, and her head hung low. The energy around her had grown even more unstable, a swirling tempest of power that threatened to consume everything in its path. Claire couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. Her fingers, still trembling, gripped the edge of the tome. The ancient words she had spoken earlier were starting to fade from her mind, replaced by a sudden, desperate clarity. She remembered one final incantation, the one that could sever the connection between Emily and the Old Ones, one that could free her. But it came with a cost. The power required to undo the curse, the ancient bond between Emily and the Old Ones, was immense. It could tear apart the very fabric of reality, destabilizing everything, unraveling the forces of nature that had held the world in balance for centuries. Claire would have to risk it all. She closed her eyes, steadied her breath, and spoke the final words. "By the power of earth, sky, and flame, I sever the bond. Let light reclaim what darkness has taken." The moment the words left her lips, a surge of energy exploded outward, the light intensifying in a flash, so bright that it burned through the trees and filled the entire clearing. The ground quaked beneath her, and Claire could feel herself being pulled toward the center of the storm. Time seemed to stretch, the force of the magic pushing her to her limits. She fought to stay upright, her legs shaking, her vision blurring as the power from the incantation surged through her, filling her with an overwhelming rush of energy. And then it stopped. Silence. Complete and total silence. Claire opened her eyes, her breath ragged as she scanned the clearing. The world had shifted again. The dark, oppressive force of the Old Ones had receded, and the forest had returned to its more familiar state. The trees, though still ancient and weathered, no longer twisted unnaturally. The sky above had lightened, the darkness dissipating like smoke, and the air no longer tasted of decay. At the center of the clearing, Emily stood, no longer the twisted vessel of light and darkness she had been. She was herself again, her eyes wide and filled with confusion, but there was a faint glimmer of recognition in them. "Claire," Emily whispered, her voice soft and hoarse. "What happened? Where are we?" Claire's heart skipped a beat as she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around Emily in a tight embrace. She had done it. She had freed her. "We're safe," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's over. We're safe." But even as she said the words, Claire knew it wasn't over, not entirely. The forest was still alive, still watching them. And though the old ones had been pushed back, they hadn't been defeated. The balance had been restored for now, but the forces that had been awakened would not remain dormant forever. The light in Claire's chest flickered weakly, a reminder that the forest magic was still within her, still fighting for dominance. And Emily, her friend, her sister, stood in the same uncertain place. She had been saved, but at what cost? The power she had once wielded was still there, simmering beneath the surface, and Claire couldn't ignore the truth. They had only bought themselves time. "I don't know what to do now," Emily murmured, her voice breaking. "I feel different, like something's still there, still pulling at me." Claire pulled back just enough to meet Emily's gaze, her hand gently brushing Emily's cheek. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew they would face it together. They had survived the worst of it together, and now they would find a way to rebuild, to learn, to live. The light that had once burned so fiercely inside her had dimmed, but Claire knew it would never fully fade. It was a part of her now, a part of the forest, a part of everything they had gone through. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now, they were safe, but the world had changed, and so had they. The clearing was silent, save for the faint rustling of the trees. Claire and Emily stood together in the center, their shoulders touching, the bond between them now stronger than ever. But despite the victory, a lingering tension filled the air, one that neither of them could shake. Emily's hands were trembling slightly as she turned them over, inspecting the palms, as if expecting to see remnants of the magic that had once flowed through her. "I don't understand," she said softly. "What happened to me? To the forest? It all felt so real, Claire, like it was controlling me." Claire swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "It wasn't you. The forest, the magic, it was using you, Emily. It's ancient, more powerful than anything we could have imagined. But you fought back. You're stronger than you think." But even as she said it, Claire wasn't sure she believed her own words. Emily was free from the grip of the old ones for now. But the magic of the forest, its call, its influence, still hovered at the edge of her consciousness. Could Emily really stay free of it? Would the darkness come back? And what if it came for them both? Claire glanced over her shoulder at the altar that had once been the epicenter of Emily's transformation. It lay dormant now. Nothing but a stone relic in the middle of the forest, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice firm as she looked around the clearing one last time. "The forest won't stop. It's too old, too powerful. We can't stay here." "But what if it follows us?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. "What if it never stops coming for us?" Claire shook her head. "It won't. Not if we keep moving, keep going. The old ones are gone for now. But the magic still lingers, and it might take time for it to resurface. I don't know if we can stop it forever, but I do know that staying here, in this place, it's too dangerous." Emily nodded slowly, but her eyes still held a glint of fear. "Where do we go, Claire? How do we get away from something that's inside us?" For a moment, Claire didn't answer. The truth was she didn't know. There was no map, no clear path forward. They had entered this forest with one goal: to stop the magic from taking Emily. Now, the goal had shifted. They needed to protect themselves from that same magic and protect the world from it as well. But even as Claire looked around, trying to find a way forward, she felt an unexpected flicker of hope. The bond between her and Emily was still strong. The light within her, though dim, was still a part of her. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to navigate the unknown together. "I don't know," Claire said finally, "but we'll figure it out. Together." Emily gave her a small, uncertain smile. Together. The two of them walked in silence for a while, their feet crunching over the dry leaves and the earth beneath them soft but firm, as if the land itself had breathed a sigh of relief. The wind had picked up again, but this time it was gentle, like the touch of a hand, as if the forest itself was calming down. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the light began to change. The shadows lengthened, and the fading rays of the sun cast a golden glow across the path ahead. There was something about the way the light filtered through the trees that felt different now. Lighter, like the forest wasn't pressing down on them anymore, but was simply there alive, yes, but no longer a threat. "There's something I've been thinking about," Emily said, her voice breaking through Claire's thoughts. "When I touched the altar, it was like I was in a dream, a memory. The forest called to me, Claire. It spoke to me, and when the old ones came, I could feel their presence, like they were always there, waiting for the right time." Claire turned to her, concern flashing across her face. "Emily, I know." Emily cut in softly. "I know. You're worried, but it's not like that. Not exactly. It's like I'm connected to the forest now. Like part of me is always going to be tied to it." She paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know if it's a curse or a gift, or both." The words echoed in Claire's mind. A curse or a gift. The truth of it was, Claire didn't know what to believe anymore. She had watched Emily struggle with the darkness, with the forest that had sought to claim her, and she had seen the strength that Emily possessed in overcoming it. But what if the darkness was still there, waiting to come back? What if Emily had become a part of the forest, just as she feared? "We'll figure it out," Claire repeated, more to herself than to Emily. "I promise." They continued walking, the forest opening up before them. In the distance, a thin trail snaked through the trees, leading toward what appeared to be a break in the woods. A way out. They could escape. But even as Claire looked ahead, the unease gnawed at her. This wasn't just a journey for survival. The forest magic had changed them both. The connection between Emily and the ancient power of the forest wasn't something that would go away easily. And as the sun dipped lower, casting an eerie golden light through the trees, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the old ones, though gone for now, weren't the only danger lurking in the darkness. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them as Claire and Emily walked, the dense trees parting occasionally to reveal glimpses of the darkening sky. The path they were on felt oddly familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for them. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to watch them, the air thick with an unseen presence. Though the immediate danger had passed, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something else, something more insidious, was following them. It was as though the forest, once a place of refuge, was now a prison from which they couldn't escape. Emily had grown quieter with every step. Her earlier anxiety had transformed into something more tangible, a wariness that she hadn't fully acknowledged before. The further they walked, the more she seemed to distance herself, as if the pull of the forest was once again beginning to tug at her. It was subtle, but Claire could see the shift in her. Her steps had become slower, and her once steady gaze now darted nervously from side to side. "Are you all right?" Claire asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Her heart ached at the look of unease in Emily's eyes. Emily hesitated, then nodded, though her smile was weak, as though she were trying to convince herself more than Claire. "Yeah, I think so. It's just, I can feel it, Claire. The forest. It's calling to me." Claire felt a chill slide down her spine at the words. She hadn't wanted to say it out loud, but she had feared it for some time now. The magic that had been awakened in Emily, the magic that had tried to claim her, was far from gone. Emily was no longer a mere person. She was tied to the forest, and whether it was a curse or a gift, it didn't matter. The pull would never fully cease. "We need to keep moving," Claire said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The farther we get from the altar, the safer we'll be." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It wasn't just the altar that had tied Emily to the forest. The magic was inside her now. And though they had won this battle, there would be more. The old ones had been defeated, for now. But that didn't mean they were gone forever. "Claire," Emily's voice broke through her thoughts. I can't run from it anymore. It's in me." Claire stopped in her tracks, turning to face her. Emily's eyes were wide, desperate. She looked torn, a battle waging inside her that Claire couldn't fully understand. It was like watching someone trapped between two worlds, and the longer she stayed in that place, the harder it would be to escape. "We can't give up," Claire said firmly, her eyes softening as she reached out to touch Emily's arm. "We'll find a way, Emily. I know it's hard, but we're stronger than this. Together." But Emily shook her head. "I don't know if we are. The forest power isn't something we can just escape from. It's inside me, Claire, and I can feel it. It's waiting, always waiting for me to fall." Claire's stomach twisted, but she refused to let her fear show. "You're not alone in this. I'm here. We'll find a way." Emily looked at her, a small flicker of hope in her eyes, but it was clear the weight of the magic was wearing on her. She had been through so much already, and the thought of losing herself again was terrifying. Emily had always been strong, but this was something entirely different. They continued walking, but the forest seemed to grow darker with every step. The trees towered overhead, their thick trunks blocking out what little light remained. The path ahead was obscured by the shadows, and the deeper they went, the more the silence seemed to close in around them, suffocating and oppressive. Just when Claire thought they might be lost in the suffocating gloom, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was small at first, a glimmer barely visible through the trees. But as they drew closer, it grew brighter, warmer, like a beacon in the dark. A pale, golden light shone from between the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. Claire's heart skipped a beat. "Do you see that?" she whispered, the words barely audible in the thick silence. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "What is it?" The light seemed to pulse gently, as if inviting them closer, beckoning them forward. Despite the unease growing within her, Claire felt an undeniable pull toward it. She reached out to Emily, her grip tightening around her friend's arm. "We should check it out. Maybe it's a way out of the forest. Or maybe it's something else. But we have to go." Emily hesitated, but then nodded, her expression reluctant but determined. They made their way toward the light, the dense trees parting as if allowing them passage. It was as if the forest itself was yielding to the mysterious source of illumination. The closer they got, the more the light seemed to grow, until it was almost blinding, filling the air with warmth and energy. As they reached the clearing, they found themselves standing before a massive stone arch. The arch was intricately carved with symbols that were alien to Claire, their meaning lost to time. Vines and moss clung to the stone, but it was clear that the arch had been here for centuries, perhaps longer. At the base of the arch, a glowing blue orb pulsed with the same light that had led them here. It floated just above the ground, its surface rippling like liquid, shifting in a way that made it seem almost alive. "What is this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Claire didn't know the answer, but as she stared at the orb, something deep inside her stirred, a sensation she couldn't explain, a connection to the light that was as strong as the pull she had felt to the forest's heart. The light was alive, yes, but it wasn't the forest's magic. This was something different, something older. "We need to touch it," Claire said before she even realized the words had left her lips. She didn't know why, but she knew it was the right thing to do. There was no turning back now. Emily stepped forward, hesitant but trusting. As her hand neared the orb, it began to hum, its energy vibrating in the air. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a shockwave of power coursed through her, sending a jolt of energy through her entire body. The world around them seemed to warp. The clearing vanished, replaced by an overwhelming darkness. The world around Claire and Emily seemed to vanish, replaced by an eerie stillness, a vast darkness that stretched out endlessly. The ground beneath their feet was gone, and the air felt thick, charged with an unknown power. Claire instinctively reached out for Emily's hand, gripping it tightly as the darkness pressed in on them from all sides. There was no sound, no light, only an oppressive silence that gnawed at her senses. It was as if they had stepped into another realm altogether, one that existed outside time and space. The orb pulsed in Emily's hand, its glow intensifying, and Claire could feel the energy surging through her. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, ancient hum vibrating within her chest. It was as if the orb was alive, as if it had always been waiting for them. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps, her grip tightening around the orb. She looked at Claire, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What is happening? Where are we?" "I don't know," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "But whatever this is, we have to stay together. Don't let go of the orb." Emily nodded, but her expression was filled with uncertainty. The glow from the orb bathed their faces in pale light, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond their reach. As they stood there, suspended in the vast void, a faint sound began to echo in the distance, a soft, distant hum that grew louder with every passing moment. The air around them seemed to shift, as though something was moving, something ancient and alive. Then, the darkness ahead of them began to change. Shapes began to materialize. At first, shadows that flickered like fleeting thoughts, then more solid forms, towering and indistinct. They were figures shifting in and out of focus, their movements slow and deliberate. Their presence filled the space with an overwhelming sense of power, ancient, unyielding, and unknowable. Claire's heart raced as the figures drew closer, their forms becoming clearer. They were beings of light and shadow, their features shifting constantly, as though they were composed of both the material and the ethereal. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a cold, unfeeling intelligence. The figures stopped in front of them, their towering forms blocking the path ahead. And then one of them spoke, its voice reverberating through the void like a thunderclap, deep and resonant. "You should not have come here." The words were not spoken by a single voice, but by the collective, an echoing chorus that filled the space with a sense of foreboding. The ground seemed to vibrate with their words, and Claire felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on her. She took a step back, her heart pounding. Who are you?" The figure that had spoken leaned forward, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural light. "We are the Watchers, the keepers of the boundary. You have crossed into a realm where the past, the present, and the future converge. The orb you hold is not a gift, but a tether, a bridge between worlds." Emily's grip on the orb tightened as the weight of the words sank in. Claire could feel the energy radiating from it, now pulsing faster, more erratically, as if responding to the Watcher's presence. "You have awakened that which should have remained dormant. The forest magic was only a small part of the web that binds this place. And now, you have invited the ancient forces into your world." Claire's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what the Watcher was saying. But the forest, the old ones, they were trying to use Emily. I had to stop them. The Watcher's form shifted, and Claire could feel its gaze turning toward Emily. The forest is but one thread in a greater tapestry. Its power flows through many worlds, many realms. And now you have brought it to the surface. The balance has been shattered. Emily's breath hitched. She was trembling, the orb in her hand now crackling with energy, its glow brighter than ever before. "I didn't mean to. I didn't ask for this." The Watcher's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Claire thought she saw something like pity in its unfathomable eyes. "The forces you have disturbed are beyond your understanding. They will not be silenced easily, and neither will you." The word sent a chill down Claire's spine, but before she could respond, the Watcher's form began to change. It expanded, growing larger and more imposing, until it was a towering presence that seemed to fill the void. Its arms stretched out, and with them, the darkness around them began to writhe and twist, as if the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. The price has been paid, and now the world will feel the consequences. The light from the orb surged in response, brighter and more intense than ever before. The darkness retreated as if repelled by the light, but the Watchers did not seem fazed. They merely stood there, watching, waiting. Emily cried out as the energy from the orb surged through her. her body glowing with an unnatural light. The Watcher's presence seemed to pull at her, drawing out the magic within her like a siphon. Claire could feel it too, an invisible force tugging at them both, threatening to tear them apart. In a split second, Emily's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "I have to end this. I have to stop it before it's too late." Claire reached for Emily, but it was as if an invisible barrier had formed between them. She couldn't reach her. "Emily, no! Don't do it!" But Emily's eyes had turned to a pale silver, glowing with an otherworldly light. Her voice was no longer her own. It was filled with the power of the Watchers. "The orb is not my salvation. It is my curse, and now I will end it, before it claims everything." With a final, desperate cry, Emily raised the orb high above her head. The light from it intensified to an unbearable level, filling the space with a blinding radiance. And then, everything exploded into pure, searing light. The blinding light engulfed everything, sweeping through Claire like a surge of energy that left her breathless. She could feel the force of it, a burning heat that pressed against her skin, searing her from the inside out. The world around her spun, disorienting and chaotic, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart and remade in an instant. For a moment, Claire could no longer feel the ground beneath her feet. She couldn't see Emily. She couldn't hear anything, not even the pounding of her own heart. All that existed was the unbearable radiance that filled every inch of the void. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light faded. The blinding intensity vanished, leaving behind a deep, suffocating silence. Claire gasped for air, her lungs aching, her vision blurred. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her head, but the world around her remained a dizzying whirl of shadows and shifting forms. The darkness that had once been all-encompassing now seemed to retreat into the corners of her mind, leaving an eerie stillness behind. When Claire's vision finally cleared, she found herself standing in a place unlike anything she had ever seen. The void was gone, replaced by an endless horizon stretching out before her, a barren wasteland of cracked earth and scorched trees. The sky above was a deep, unnatural red, as though the sun had been replaced by a sickly, blood-colored moon. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken weight that made it hard to breathe. And there, standing in the center of the wasteland, was Emily. Her body was cloaked in the same radiant light that had filled the void. She was motionless, her arms outstretched as if holding something invisible in the air. Her face was expressionless, her eyes, now glowing a pale silver, fixed on some distant point, as though she were in a trance. Claire's heart clenched in her chest. She took a step forward, her legs trembling beneath her as the gravity of the situation sank in. Emily had done it. She had activated the orb's power, and in doing so, she had opened a gateway to something else. Something dangerous. "Emily," Claire called, her voice barely a whisper in the heavy, oppressive air. Emily didn't respond. She didn't even move. It was as if Claire's voice couldn't reach her, as if she were trapped in a world beyond her own. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't lose her now, not after everything they had been through. She had to find a way to bring Emily back. But the longer she stood there, the more she felt the overwhelming weight of the place pressing down on her. The more she understood that this was no ordinary world. This was a place outside of time, a place where the balance of power had already been disrupted. And the Watchers had warned them. The price had been paid. Claire stumbled forward, her gaze never leaving Emily. She had to reach her, no matter the cost. She couldn't let her be consumed by whatever force had taken hold of her. But as she drew closer, the air seemed to crackle with energy, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. Then in an instant, the silence shattered. A low rumble echoed through the wasteland, a sound like the groan of some great, ancient beast stirring from its slumber. The ground cracked open, and a deep, guttural voice reverberated through the very air. "You have opened the door." Claire froze. The voice was everywhere, surrounding her, seeping into her thoughts. It was the same voice she had heard before, the Watchers or something like them. But now it felt different. Darker. You have crossed the threshold, and now the world will know the cost of your trespass. Claire looked around frantically, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one to be seen. The wasteland stretched on, empty and desolate, the twisted trees and cracked earth offering no answers. And then the sky above them began to change. The sickly red hue deepened, swirling like a storm cloud, growing darker and darker until it was nearly black. From within the depths of the sky, shapes began to emerge, massive, shadowy forms that stretched down, reaching toward the earth like tendrils of smoke. The figures were unlike anything Claire had ever seen. They were vast, shifting, and formless, made of pure darkness and shadow. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, burning with an intelligence that was both ancient and terrifying. "The price has been paid," the voice repeated, this time closer, almost as if it were standing right behind her. "The balance is lost, and you have brought the reckoning." Claire turned to Emily, who was still standing motionless in the center of the wasteland, her arms outstretched, her body glowing with the radiant light from the orb. The energy around her seemed to hum with power, as though it were drawing in the very essence of the world itself. But it wasn't enough. Emily's power was not just her own. It was the forest's, the Watchers, and something far older, far more dangerous. The ground beneath Claire's feet began to tremble more violently, and the air crackled with an overwhelming energy. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Claire pushed herself toward Emily, forcing herself through the crushing energy that surrounded them. The closer she got, the more the power pressed against her, trying to keep her back. It felt as if the world itself was rejecting her, as if it wanted her to leave. But Claire wouldn't stop. Not now. "Emily!" Claire cried out, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Please, come back." For a moment, there was no response. But then, slowly, Emily's head turned, her glowing silver eyes meeting Claire's. Her expression was unreadable, her face still and emotionless. But there was something in her eyes, something that made Claire's heart skip a beat. It was as if Emily was looking at her, but at the same time, through her, as if she wasn't really there. "Claire." Emily's voice was soft, distant, like an echo of her own. "It's too late. I've already done what I had to." "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head furiously. "No, Emily, you don't have to do this. You're stronger than this. You can fight it. You're not alone." But Emily's eyes remained cold and unblinking, her lips moving in a quiet, almost mournful expression. "I've already made my choice." Suddenly, the orb in Emily's hand flared with light, and the energy around them surged violently, knocking Claire to the ground. The force of it sent a shock wave through the air, causing the ground to split open in great cracks. And then, the Watchers' voices spoke once more, their words reverberating through Claire's bones. "The reckoning has begun." The air was thick with an unsettling energy, a hum that vibrated deep within Claire's chest. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her as she struggled to push herself back to her feet, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. Emily, her friend, her companion, had made her choice, and now they were both trapped in a reality that no longer seemed to belong to either of them. The ground beneath them trembled again, and the sky above darkened further, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the fate that was unfolding before them. The Watcher's presence loomed over the wasteland, their unseen forms pressing in from all sides, their voices reverberating through Claire's very soul. "It is done. The reckoning has begun," they repeated, their voices now an overwhelming chorus of ancient, terrifying power. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the orb's energy swirling around them, stronger than ever before, feeding off the power that Emily had unleashed. The world around them seemed to warp and twist, as though reality itself was starting to unravel. "Emily!" Claire shouted, her voice filled with desperation. She rushed forward, her hands outstretched, but once again, an invisible force held her back, keeping her from reaching her friend. It was as though the very fabric of the world was pushing her away, preventing her from getting any closer. Emily's expression remained unchanged, her face a blank mask, her silver eyes fixed on something far beyond Claire's reach. He didn't seem to hear her anymore. The power within her, the orb, was consuming her, turning her into something else, something beyond human comprehension. Claire's mind raced. She had to do something. She couldn't lose Emily like this, not after everything they had been through. She couldn't let the orb take her friend away completely, couldn't let the Watchers win. But what could she do? The power of the orb was beyond anything Claire had ever understood, and the Watcher's influence was suffocating. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the only thing she could do was watch as Emily drifted further away from her grasp. Suddenly, a deep, hollow sound echoed through the wasteland, louder than the rumblings of the earth beneath them. It was a bell, or something like it, a sound that seemed to resonate through the very core of the world. Claire's heart stopped. She recognized it instantly. The same sound she had heard when they first discovered the orb. The same sound that had led them to the forest, to this place, to this moment. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement at the edge of Claire's vision. But as it grew closer, it became clearer, an ethereal, otherworldly being, its form made of shifting light and shadow, its presence both comforting and terrifying all at once. Claire froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was the Watcher, the one who had spoken to them before, the one who had warned them of the consequences of their actions. The same voice that had echoed through the wasteland, and now, here it was, standing before them. The Watcher's form flickered like a flame, its glowing eyes fixed on Claire with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being drawn into its very soul. "You should not have come," the Watcher intoned, its voice low and resonant. "The door you opened cannot be closed. The reckoning cannot be undone." Claire's chest tightened, her fear growing as the Watcher's gaze bore into her. Emily. I can't lose her. Please help me. There has to be something we can do." The Watcher's eyes softened, and for a moment, Claire thought she saw something like pity flicker across its face. "You are not the first to try to stop the tide. Many have come before you, and many have failed. The orb's power is not meant for mortals. It was never meant to be wielded by those who walk in a world of flesh and bone." "But she's my friend," Claire pleaded, her voice breaking. "I can't just leave her like this. I won't." The Watcher's form seemed to shift, its presence becoming more tangible, more real. It stepped closer, its glowing eyes never leaving Claire's face. The cost of this power is too great. She has chosen her path, and you cannot change that. You cannot save her, but you can save yourself. Claire's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The Watcher's eyes flickered toward Emily, who was still standing in the center of the wasteland, her arms outstretched, her body glowing with an unearthly radiance. She has become something else, a vessel for the forces beyond this world. There is no turning back for her now. But you still have a choice. You can leave. You can walk away and allow the reckoning to unfold as it was meant to. "No," Claire said, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision. "I won't leave her. I can't just abandon her." The Watcher's expression darkened, its eyes narrowing in what could only be described as sorrow. "Then you will be consumed as well. The forces you have disturbed cannot be ignored. The reckoning will claim both of you, and all that you know will be lost." Claire swallowed hard, the decision weighing heavily on her chest. But she knew what she had to do. She couldn't leave Emily behind, not after everything they had endured together. "Please," Claire whispered, her voice soft and broken. "There must be a way to save her. Please help me." The Watcher hesitated, its form flickering once more. For a moment, it was as if it were considering something ancient and powerful that Claire could never comprehend. And then, with a deep sigh that seemed to shake the very air around them, the Watcher spoke once more. There is one way, but know this, the price is unimaginable. You will face the consequences of your choice, and there will be no escape. If you wish to save her, you must take the orb from her. You must sever the tether that binds her to the forces beyond. But the power of the orb is not easily relinquished. It will fight you, and in the end, you will be left with nothing but the ashes of what once was. Claire looked at Emily, her heart breaking. She could feel the orb's power thrumming in the air, a force beyond anything she could understand. But she knew what she had to do. "Then I'll do it," Claire said, her voice steady, despite the fear that gripped her heart. "I'll save her, no matter the cost." The Watcher nodded, its form beginning to fade, its voice lingering in the air. "So be it. But remember, the reckoning will not be kind." With those final words, the Watcher was gone, leaving Claire alone in the wasteland. The orb's light pulsed, brighter than ever, and Claire knew that the time had come to face the greatest challenge of her life. She took a deep breath and began to walk toward Emily, her steps resolute, her heart filled with determination. Claire's heart thundered in her chest as she approached Emily. The oppressive energy in the air seemed to pulse with each step she took, the very ground beneath her feet vibrating with the raw power of the orb. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make her move. Emily remained motionless in the center of the wasteland, her body still bathed in the radiant glow of the orb. Her arms were outstretched, as if reaching for something beyond the horizon, her expression blank and distant. There was no sign of recognition in her silver eyes, just an empty, hollow stare that pierced through Claire's heart. The distance between them seemed to stretch on forever, but Claire pushed forward, her determination unwavering. She couldn't lose Emily. Not like this. Not after everything they had endured. She had to save her, no matter what it took. As she drew closer, the air around her seemed to thicken, the energy of the orb pressing in from all sides. Every step was a battle against the invisible force that sought to keep her away. The closer she got, the more intense the pressure became, as though the orb itself were fighting her, trying to protect Emily from the outside world. But Claire would not be deterred. She had come too far to turn back now. When she finally reached Emily, the light from the orb seemed to swell, flooding the wasteland with an even brighter radiance. Claire reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against Emily's arm. The touch sent a jolt of energy through her, and she recoiled instinctively. The orb's power surged, crackling in the air like static electricity. "Emily," Claire whispered, her voice strained with emotion. "I'm here. Please come back to me. I won't leave you." For a long moment, there was no response. Emily remained silent, her body still, her eyes distant. The silence was suffocating, a heavy weight that pressed down on Claire's chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, very slowly, Emily's head turned toward her. Her silver eyes locked onto Claire's, but there was something cold in them, something that didn't belong. It was as if the person she had once known was no longer there, replaced by something else, something alien. "Claire," Emily's voice was barely a whisper, distant and hollow. "You shouldn't have come." Claire's heart cracked at the sound of her friend's voice, so different from the Emily she had known. "I had to, Emily. You're not alone. I'm not leaving you." But Emily only shook her head, a sad, empty smile flickering on her lips. "You can't save me. It's too late. The orb has already chosen me. I'm beyond saving." "No," Claire said, her voice rising in desperation. "You don't understand. I'm not leaving you to this. This thing, we can fight it. We can fight the orb together. Please, Emily, please come back to me." The orb pulsed again, brighter this time, as if reacting to Claire's words. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air grew heavier, as though the very atmosphere was about to collapse. Claire's body ached with the force of the energy swirling around them, but she refused to let it stop her. She had to save Emily. There was no other choice. Before she could speak again, Emily's eyes flashed with an unearthly light, and her voice changed, taking on a hollow, otherworldly tone. You don't understand, Claire. The reckoning is here. The power of the orb is beyond anything you could ever comprehend. It's too late to stop it. Claire recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. The orb's power was taking hold of Emily completely. She could see it now. Emily wasn't just a vessel for the orb's energy. She had become one with it. The orb had merged with her, its will entwined with Emily's, its power consuming her from the inside out. "I don't care about the orb's power," Claire shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "I care about you. I won't lose you to this." But Emily's smile only deepened, and a dark, guttural laugh escaped her lips. "It's too late, Claire. You can't fight the reckoning. The Watchers were right. The price has already been paid. There is no turning back now." The air around them shifted, and the ground cracked open, dark tendrils of energy rising from the earth like serpents, their writhing forms reaching toward the sky. The sky above darkened further, the blood-red hue now bleeding into a sickening black as the forces of the orb began to manifest in full force. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had to act fast. The Watcher had told her what needed to be done. She had to sever the tether between Emily and the orb. But how could she do that without destroying her friend in the process? Without thinking, Claire reached for the orb, her hands trembling with fear and uncertainty. The moment her fingers made contact with it, a shockwave of energy slammed into her, throwing her backward. The orb pulsed with a blinding light, and Claire felt her body being pulled toward it, as if the very fabric of her being were being consumed by the energy it radiated. "No!" Claire screamed, fighting against the pull. She dug her heels into the cracked earth, her hands grasping for anything to hold on to, but it was useless. The force of the orb was too great. It was as if the very world around her was bending to its will, trying to swallow her whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the force stopped. Claire was left gasping for breath, her body trembling from the sheer intensity of the experience. But when she looked up, Emily was no longer standing before her. The wasteland had vanished. The orb was gone, and in its place, only an endless void remained. Claire stood alone in the dark, her heart racing, her mind reeling. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears as she stood amidst the darkness, the ground beneath her feeling like soft, shifting sand. The vast void stretched on endlessly, as if there were no end, no horizon, only an oppressive, all-consuming blackness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The faint glow of the orb had disappeared, leaving her with nothing but the eerie silence that now pressed in around her. The air was thick, dense with something she couldn't define, a sensation that crawled beneath her skin, like the world itself was watching her every move. There were no stars above, no moon, just an endless void, and the whisper of something far off, distant, like an echo of a voice lost in time. "Emily," Claire's voice trembled as it broke the silence. "Where are you?" There was no answer. Her heart pounded in her chest. She felt the weight of the emptiness closing in on her, suffocating her. The pull of the orb had vanished, but now there was something else, something more insidious. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, leaving her stranded in this blackened abyss. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a soft rustling, as if something was moving through the darkness. Claire froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The shadows around her seemed to shift, coiling and unraveling like living things. "Emily," Claire called again, her voice barely more than a whisper. She strained her ears, desperate for some sign that her friend was still here, still somewhere in this forsaken place. And then she saw it. A faint glimmer appeared on the horizon, a small, flickering light that seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. It was familiar, but distorted, a pale reflection of the orb, flickering like a dying star. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know whether to approach or run, but something deep inside told her that this was the only way forward. With every step she took, the light grew brighter, casting strange, unnatural shadows on the barren ground. The darkness seemed to recoil from it, as if the light itself was pushing back against the void. But as Claire drew closer, the air grew colder, the atmosphere heavier, until she could barely breathe. And then she saw her. Emily stood at the center of the light, her back turned to Claire. Her arms were outstretched once again, but this time, they didn't tremble with the orb's power. No, her posture was different now, more composed, more in control, like someone who had embraced their fate rather than fought against it. Her long hair, once wild and untamed, now flowed smoothly behind her, as if the wind were guiding it. But her face, Claire's stomach dropped as she took in the sight. Emily's once soft, human features were now distorted, twisted. Her skin had taken on a pale, ashen hue, and her eyes, those silver eyes, were no longer her own. They glowed with an unnatural, piercing light, too bright to look at directly. "Emily!" Claire cried out, her voice filled with both relief and fear. She took a step forward, her body trembling. Please tell me you're still you. Don't do this." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, her head tilting in a strange, almost mechanical motion, her expression unreadable. The faint light around her flickered, casting long shadows that distorted her figure. There was something otherworldly in the way she moved, too precise, too controlled, as if she was no longer fully human. "Claire!" Emily's voice echoed, but it was not the voice Claire remembered. It was hollow, distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. "You shouldn't have followed me here." "No!" Claire shouted, her voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you, Emily. I won't let you be swallowed by them." Emily's eyes, those glowing silver orbs, shifted toward her. For a moment, Claire thought she saw a flicker of something familiar, a spark of recognition. But it was fleeting, gone before she could even hope for it. "You've already lost me," Emily said softly. "The orb has changed me, and with it the reckoning. I'm no longer who I was. I've become something else, something beyond." Claire's chest tightened. She shook her head, stepping closer. "No, Emily, you're still you. I know you are. You can fight it. Please, just come back to me." But Emily didn't move. The light around her pulsed, growing brighter with each passing second. The intensity of it sent waves of heat through the air, making Claire's skin prickle uncomfortably. The darkness around them seemed to retreat in response, as if it couldn't bear the light. "I can't go back," Emily whispered. "You've come too far, Claire. The reckoning is already here, and there is no turning away from it. I've made my choice, and so have you." Claire's eyes widened as the meaning of Emily's words sank in. Her heart pounded in her chest. "No, I haven't made any choice yet. I'm not leaving without you." The ground beneath Claire's feet trembled again. The shadows deepened, and the temperature dropped as the light from Emily flickered and sputtered. The void around them seemed to close in on itself, as if it were preparing for something horrible. Emily raised her arms again, the light intensifying in a sudden burst of energy that made Claire shield her eyes. The air seemed to hum with a terrifying vibration, like the sound of 1,000 whispers, each one carrying a warning, an ancient curse. "Claire," Emily said, her voice now cold, almost mechanical. "You cannot save me, but you still have a choice. You can walk away. You can leave this place and never return. You can save yourself." Claire's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white. She could feel the pull of the orb's power, its relentless grip tightening around her heart. The reckoning was here, and there was no escape from it. But there was one thing she still held on to. "No," Claire whispered, her voice steady, though her heart ached. "I'm not leaving you. I won't." Emily's expression hardened, her silver eyes flashing with a fierce light. "Then you will face it, Claire. You will face the reckoning with me. And when it is done, there will be no going back." Before Claire could respond, the world around them seemed to fracture, the void splintering like broken glass. Reality itself began to warp and bend, folding in on itself as the orb's power surged once again. And then, with a blinding flash of light, everything disappeared. The world snapped back into focus with a violent jolt, and Claire gasped for air as if she had been underwater. Her body was weightless, suspended in nothingness for a fleeting moment, before gravity returned with a crushing force. She stumbled forward, her knees buckling beneath her. The ground was cold and uneven, and the air, thick with energy, burned her lungs as if every breath she took was a struggle. Claire blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The oppressive darkness still clung to the edges of her vision, but something had changed. The void that had surrounded them was gone, replaced by a strange, barren landscape. The sky overhead was a swirling mass of deep purple and black, the stars distant and scattered like dying embers. There was no sun, only a haunting, ethereal glow that illuminated the twisted, jagged shapes of the land. In the distance, she saw a flickering light. It was too familiar. The orb, the same pale, pulsating glow that had consumed Emily. It hovered in the air, suspended like a beacon in the middle of this desolate world. And beneath it, beneath that light, stood Emily. Her figure was outlined in the orb's radiance, her body still, unmoving. But this was no longer the Emily Claire had known. The transformation had deepened. Her features were sharp, her eyes glowing like molten silver. Her skin, once warm and alive, was now pale, almost translucent, the faintest hints of veins running beneath the surface. She seemed to be tethered to the orb, her very existence bound by its power. "Emily," Claire whispered, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Please, I'm here. Don't let this destroy you." But Emily didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge Claire's presence. Her eyes were fixed on the orb, as if she were no longer aware of the world around her. The power in the air was unbearable, as though every molecule of space was vibrating with the force of the orb's energy. Claire took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The light from the orb seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with every movement. It was as if the very fabric of reality itself was responding to the orb's will. She knew she had to act fast. Emily was slipping away from her. The reckoning was unfolding, and there was no more time to waste. Taking a deep breath, Claire called out to her friend once more. "Emily, listen to me. You don't have to do this. You can fight it. Please." The air grew heavier, and the shadows around Claire seemed to shift, swirling like smoke. The orb's light flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the land. It was as if the world itself was rejecting her words, trying to drown them out. And then, to her shock, Emily's voice rang out, low and cold. "It's too late, Claire. The reckoning has begun. You should never have followed me." Claire's throat constricted, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I'm not leaving you to this," she said firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't leave you to this, no matter what." Emily turned slowly, her gaze locking onto Claire's. For a fleeting moment, the intensity in her eyes flickered, as if a part of her was still fighting, still there. But the light from the orb burned so brightly that it seemed to smother any trace of humanity in her. Emily's expression became one of indifference, as if she were looking at Claire through a veil, disconnected from the world around her. "You don't understand," Emily said, her voice now cold and detached. "The reckoning is inevitable. The orb, it is a gateway, a conduit for something greater. The power it holds is beyond anything you could ever comprehend. It has already claimed me, and now it will claim you as well." Claire shook her head, her chest tight with emotion. "No, Emily, you're wrong. This isn't you talking. You don't have to let the orb control you. I know you can fight it. Please, fight it." Emily's eyes darkened, and the ground beneath Claire's feet trembled with an ominous force. The orb's light intensified, becoming blinding in its brilliance. It felt as though the very fabric of the world was tearing apart, unraveling in the face of the orb's power. "You're wasting your time," Emily said, her voice a hollow whisper. "There is no fighting this. There is only acceptance." Suddenly, The ground beneath them split open with a deafening roar, jagged cracks forming in the earth like the claws of some monstrous beast. Dark tendrils of energy shot up from the fissures, twisting and writhing in the air, reaching out like grasping hands. The sky above them darkened further, and a loud, guttural rumble echoed through the land, shaking Claire to her core. Emily lifted her arms, and the tendrils responded, coiling around her like serpents. The orb pulsed violently, sending waves of power crashing through the land. The very earth seemed to groan beneath the weight of it all. Claire's heart raced. She had to stop this. She couldn't let Emily be consumed by the reckoning. The air crackled with electricity as Claire took a step toward the orb, her body trembling with the sheer force of the energy swirling around her. She could feel it now. The orb was alive, and it was feeding off the destruction it had wrought. Claire reached out, her hand trembling as she extended it toward the orb. As her fingers neared the pulsating light, a wave of energy slammed into her chest, knocking her back. She cried out in pain as she crashed to the ground, her body jarred with the force of the impact. The tendrils of energy continued to writhe in the air, lashing out like whips, but they didn't strike her. Instead, they seemed to be drawn toward Emily, as though the orb's power was calling them. The ground beneath Emily's feet began to crack and warp, the tendrils wrapping around her like a dark cocoon. Claire struggled to her feet, her vision blurry from the impact. The ground beneath her was shifting again, the world seemingly on the verge of collapse. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back now. But Claire refused to give up. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. She had to save Emily. She had to. "Emily!" Claire cried out, her voice breaking through the chaos. "Fight it. Please fight it." For a moment, there was no response. Emily remained still, her form illuminated by the orb's blinding light. But then, in a whisper that seemed to echo across the void, Claire heard it. "Claire, I'm sorry." And with that, the light from the orb intensified, swallowing everything around them in a blinding flash. The blinding light of the orb consumed everything, every sound, every sensation, until Claire was suspended in pure, overwhelming whiteness. For a long moment, she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed, or if she was still even alive. The world as she knew it had ceased to exist. She was alone in this vast, radiant emptiness, a prisoner of the orb's might. Then, slowly, the light began to dim, revealing the familiar shape of the desolate land beneath her feet. But the world had changed again. The cracks in the ground were larger now, more pronounced, and the sky had deepened into a sickly shade of red, casting a twisted glow over everything. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as if it were saturated with a dark, malevolent force. In the distance, Claire saw Emily again. She was standing at the center of a darkened circle, the orb floating above her like an unreachable star, its pulse sinking with her own breath. Emily's figure seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy, her body moving in slow, deliberate motions. She was still tethered to the orb, and yet she was not quite herself. Claire's heart ached. Emily looked so distant, so far removed from the friend she had once known. The reckoning was complete now, and Emily was no longer just the victim of the orb's power. She had become part of it, a vessel for something greater, something far more dangerous. With each step Claire took toward her, the distance between them grew. It was as though the world itself was pushing her away, resisting her very presence. The air thickened, becoming like thick, wet cloth, making every movement feel like wading through water. She could feel the pressure building in her chest, and the whispers began again, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but quickly growing louder. "Embrace the reckoning," the whispers urged. "It's inevitable. It's hers. She belongs to it now. Let it take you too." Claire shook her head, trying to block out the voices. They were not her own thoughts. They were foreign, invasive. They came from the orb, from whatever Emily had become. But she wouldn't listen. Not now. Not when there was still a chance. With a final burst of willpower, Claire pushed through the resistance, drawing closer to the dark circle at the center of which Emily stood. As she neared, she could feel the energy growing stronger, more oppressive, and the orb's light pulsed in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. "Emily," Claire shouted again, her voice cutting through the oppressive hum. "You don't have to do this. Please, come back to me. I'm not leaving you here." Emily turned toward her slowly, her movements like those of a marionette, jerky and unnatural. Her glowing silver eyes locked onto Claire's, and for a brief, flickering moment, there was something human, still there. But it was fleeting, fading almost as soon as Claire recognized it. "You don't understand," Emily said, her voice cold and hollow, yet laced with an undercurrent of sorrow. "The reckoning is part of me now. I can't escape it. The orb is not just power, Claire. It is knowledge, a revelation. I see everything. I understand everything. In you, you still don't understand." The ground beneath them trembled again, and dark tendrils of energy began to rise from the cracks in the earth, twisting and writhing like serpents. They snaked around Emily, caressing her, as if welcoming her transformation. The orb pulsed, sending waves of energy rippling outwards, distorting the air and shaking the very ground. "Emily, please." Claire's voice broke as she reached out to her. "We can fight this. We can figure this out together." But Emily's expression hardened, and a cruel, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "You don't get it. You still believe there's a way out. But there isn't, Claire. It's already done." The orb flared with an impossible brightness, and for a moment, Claire was forced to shield her eyes from the searing light. When she looked back, she saw Emily's form begin to shift her body, flickering and distorting as the dark energy from the orb enveloped her. Emily's outline began to blur, becoming more ethereal, as though she were transforming into something less than human. "No," Claire whispered in horror. "This isn't you. Don't let it consume you." But Emily's voice, now distant and hollow, reached Claire from the depths of the orb's light. "I have no choice. I was always meant for this. This is who I was supposed to be. In you. You're just in the way." In that instant, the darkness around them intensified, and the ground beneath Claire cracked open once more. The energy in the air became unbearable, suffocating her, pulling her toward the orb. It was as though the world was falling apart, collapsing into the very center of the light. With one final, desperate cry, Claire lunged forward, her hand outstretched, reaching for Emily. The last glimmer of hope she had was in this moment, in this final act. But just as her fingers brushed the air, the orb flared one last time, and the world shattered. Claire woke in darkness again, her mind a fog of confusion and pain. Her body ached, every muscle strained from the sudden impact. The world felt wrong. The air was stale and cold. She groaned and pushed herself upright, her hands trembling as they scraped against the rough, uneven ground. She was no longer where she had been. The barren landscape was gone, replaced by something far worse, a vast expanse of stone, cracked and desolate. The sky was dark, but there was no moon, no stars, only a dim, sickly light emanating from the jagged cliffs around her. The orb was nowhere to be seen. But Emily was still here. Her figure loomed ahead, standing like a dark silhouette against the twisted landscape, her face obscured by the shadows. The transformation was complete. The reckoning had consumed her. Claire's heart twisted in her chest as she staggered forward, breathless. There was no turning back now, but she couldn't just leave. Not like this. "Emily." Claire's voice cracked, filled with both fear and determination. "I'm not giving up. Not on you." But Emily did not respond. Instead, she turned slowly, her eyes now glowing silver and cold. She had crossed the threshold. There was no going back for her. And for Claire, it was either find a way to stop her or risk losing everything to the reckoning. The silence was deafening. Claire stood frozen, her feet sinking into the cold, uneven stone beneath her. The space around her seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, a wasteland of dark rocks and looming shadows. Yet, even in the midst of all this, there was an undeniable, pulsing presence, a dark energy that radiated from Emily, wrapping the very air in a suffocating grip. Emily remained motionless, her silver eyes reflecting no warmth, no trace of humanity. She was beyond the orb now, beyond the reckoning. Claire could see it in her posture, the way she stood still, detached from the world she once knew. It was as if she were no longer a person at all. She had become something else. Still, Claire couldn't give up. She wouldn't. With each step she took toward Emily, the distance between them seemed to grow, as if the very ground was pushing her back. Every breath was an effort now, as the air around her thickened with the dark energy that emanated from Emily. The weight of it was unbearable, and yet Claire pressed on. "Emily," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Please, I know you're still in there. This isn't who you are." Emily didn't respond immediately, but Claire could feel her gaze, heavy and unyielding, pressing against her. It was as though Emily were weighing her words, searching for something within them. But then, finally, Emily spoke, her voice like a distant echo in the vast emptiness. "You're wrong, Claire," Emily said, her voice colder than the air around them. "This is exactly who I was meant to be. The orb, it has opened my eyes. I see everything now, the truth of the world, the power that lies within me. The reckoning was always going to happen. It was inevitable." Claire's heart dropped, but she didn't let the despair overwhelm her. "I know what you're feeling right now. The power, it's overwhelming, I know. But you don't have to give in to it, Emily. This doesn't have to be the end. You can fight it. I know you can." Emily's figure flickered, as though the shadows of the world around her were swallowing her up. For a moment, her expression faltered, and something human, something Claire knew, flashed in her eyes. But it was fleeting, like a brief spark before being swallowed by the darkness again. "You don't understand," Emily said, her voice hard and unyielding. "You think you can save me, but this is beyond saving. I am already what I was always meant to be. The reckoning has shown me the truth. And now there's no place for you in this new world." Claire's chest tightened, the weight of her friend's words settling in. Emily was slipping away, further and further, and Claire could feel the loss in every beat of her heart. But there was still a sliver of hope, faint but undeniable. As long as she could reach her, somehow, there was still a chance. "No, Emily," Claire whispered. "You're wrong. The reckoning doesn't have to be this. The light, the power, it doesn't control you. You're still you. I can feel it. Please, you have to trust me." For the briefest of moments, Emily's form flickered again. Her eyes, glowing and cold, softened just a little. The pulse of the orb dimmed, if only slightly. It was a fleeting chance, one that Claire couldn't afford to miss. But before she could take another step forward, Emily's hand lifted, the shadows that surrounded her rising like dark tendrils in response. Claire froze, her body going cold as the darkness intensified. The ground shook violently, and Claire stumbled, almost losing her balance. The very air seemed to close in on her, pushing her down. She gasped for breath, the pressure suffocating, and her eyes watered from the force of the energy bearing down on her. The reckoning was threatening to consume her, and she felt it. Every fiber of her being was vibrating with the immense power that Emily had unleashed. "Leave, Claire," Emily said, her voice now almost unrecognizable, a hollow whisper that echoed through the void. "You cannot stop this. You cannot save me." "Emily," Claire cried out, her voice breaking. "You're not lost yet. I won't leave you. I refuse to leave you." A burst of dark energy surged from the orb, and Claire was thrown back, crashing to the ground with a brutal force. Her vision blurred, and she could feel blood trickling down her face from the impact. But she didn't let the pain stop her. She couldn't. Not now. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced. She had to act now. She couldn't give up. But there was a choice here, an impossible one. Could she bring Emily back? Or would she have to sacrifice everything to stop the reckoning once and for all? As Claire struggled to push herself upright, she saw it, the very source of Emily's power. The orb, glowing with an intensity that threatened to tear the world apart. It hovered above Emily, a beacon of unbearable light, pulsing in time with the dark energy that spiraled out of control. "Emily!" Claire shouted one last time, her voice raw with desperation. "Please, come back to me. We don't have to do this." But Emily's expression was resolute, cold, and indifferent. She no longer seemed to be listening. Then, in a flash of horrifying clarity, Claire understood. The orb had done something to Emily, a transformation, not just physical, but mental and spiritual. The reckoning was more than just power. It was a choice. The orb had given Emily a vision of something beyond their world, beyond everything they had known. It had shown her a truth that, once seen, couldn't be unseen. And in that truth, Emily had made her choice. But Claire had to make hers too. With the last of her strength, Claire pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the pain that surged through her body. She could feel the darkness pressing in, threatening to pull her under, but she refused to let it consume her. She would not give up, not on Emily, not on their friendship. In that final moment, Claire knew what she had to do. She couldn't fight the orb directly. She couldn't take the power from Emily. But what she could do was offer one final act of defiance, one last chance for Emily to see what she was leaving behind. Claire stepped forward again, closing the distance between them. "Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I love you, and I always will. Please, come back." And in that final, desperate plea, something in the air shifted. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, as if the very fabric of reality had taken notice. The orb flickered, its pulse slowing just a fraction. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The world trembled. The pulse of the orb, now slower and weaker, resonated through the very ground beneath Claire's feet. The air, thick with oppressive energy, seemed to stretch taut, like a thread pulled to its breaking point. For a moment, the oppressive darkness lifted, just slightly, allowing Claire to take in a breath, deep and ragged, as she steadied herself. Emily stood before her, unmoving, yet in her eyes, Claire saw something, a flicker, a brief, imperceptible hesitation. It was like a crack in the armor that the reckoning had built around her, a crack that could widen if given the right pressure. Claire's heart raced, her voice breaking through the silence once more. "Emily," she said, barely more than a whisper. "I know you can hear me. I know you're still in there. This isn't you. Please, come back to me. We can stop this together." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended in time, as though the very universe was holding its breath. The orb pulsed once again, a sudden surge of energy rippling outward. Emily's body shimmered, flickered, before stabilizing, and Claire's words hung on the edge of eternity, uncertain and fragile. And then something changed. For the briefest of moments, Emily's eyes softened, and her lips parted as if she might speak, but no sound came out. The flicker of recognition, the ghost of the friend Claire once knew, was there. Emily's form wavered, caught between the orb's pull and the humanity that had not completely abandoned her. But it didn't last long. The orb surged, its light blinding, and Emily's body stiffened. The shadows around her seemed to tighten, binding her more firmly to the energy of the reckoning. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat, unnatural and foreign. Her silver eyes hardened once again, locking onto Claire with an icy, unfeeling gaze. "Stop, Claire," Emily said, her voice no longer her own. "This is not who I am anymore. I've seen the truth. I've embraced it." "Emily, no?" Claire cried, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Don't do this. You don't have to let it consume you." But Emily only shook her head, the motion slow and deliberate, as if pitying Claire's refusal to accept what had already happened. "You still don't understand," Emily whispered, her voice hollow. "The reckoning is not an enemy. It's a gift. The power is freedom. The truth is clarity. I was blind before, but now I see everything. You're the one who is still in the dark. The shadows deepened around Emily, curling like smoke, as if responding to her words. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend and distort, the air thick with energy that was too much to comprehend, too vast to fight against. The reckoning wasn't just an event. It was a force, revelation that tore apart the rules of the world. "I won't let you go," Claire whispered, her throat tight with emotion. She stepped forward once more, moving through the heavy air, each step a battle against the pull of the darkness. "I won't leave you in this. You're not the reckoning. You're Emily." For a moment, the orb's pulse flickered again, weak, almost as if it too were uncertain. The shadows seemed to writhe, hesitating, holding back, giving Emily a final choice. But before Claire could take another step, the earth shook violently beneath their feet. A crack split the ground wide open, and from within, a deep, malevolent roar echoed up from the depths. Claire stumbled, her balance faltering as the ground threatened to split beneath her. The shadows around Emily twisted violently, coiling around her like serpents. The orb flared, sending a brilliant wave of light that washed over everything. And then everything changed. The light of the orb expanded outward in a flash of blinding brilliance, engulfing the entire world in its radiance. Claire shielded her eyes, barely able to see through the blinding glow, her heart pounding in her chest. The ground shook once more, and she stumbled, clutching onto the jagged rocks for support. The very air itself seemed to ripple, distorting, as though the fabric of reality was tearing apart. The light was so intense, it felt as though it might consume everything. And yet, as the light began to fade, a new form appeared. It wasn't Emily, not entirely. The figure standing before Claire was more than human, more than anything she had ever seen. The shadows curled around it like a cloak, its eyes, once human, now pools of silver light, devoid of warmth, emotion, or connection. The orb hovered above it, but now it was no longer in Emily's control. It was as if the reckoning had taken on a new form, a new entity. And Emily, the girl Claire had known, had vanished completely into the void, lost to the orb's immense power. "Emily," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. But the figure, this creature born from the reckoning, did not respond. It stood tall, towering over Claire with an air of inevitability. Its presence was suffocating, pressing down on Claire like a weight she could not escape. "I am not Emily," the creature said, its voice cold and impassive, like the wind itself. "But I was her. I was the one who was chosen. And now, I am the reckoning." Claire's heart skipped a beat as the words hit her like a punch. This was the result of Emily's transformation. This was what the reckoning had created. Being born of darkness, of energy, of knowledge, and of loss. But as the creature's gaze locked with hers, Claire felt something faint in the depths of its silver eyes. A trace of recognition, a shard of humanity. She knew it was still there. Somewhere inside, that thing standing before her was the girl she had called a friend. "Emily, please," Claire whispered, her breath ragged. "I'm not giving up on you. I know you're still in there. Please come back." The creature's expression softened, just the faintest shift, like a breeze stirring the stillness of the air. It hesitated, paused, almost as if considering her words, as if the power that had overtaken it was not yet fully in control. For the briefest moment, Claire thought she saw it, the Emily she had known, the girl who had once stood beside her. But then the creature's silver eyes hardened, and it stepped forward. "You are too late, Claire," it said, its voice now devoid of any emotion. "There is no going back from this." But Claire wouldn't back down. She couldn't. Not when there was a chance to save her. "Emily, listen to me," Claire begged, stepping forward again, her voice trembling but filled with a raw, desperate hope. "I love you. Please, don't let this take everything from us. Please." The creature stood silent, and the orb above it pulsed in time with Claire's racing heartbeat. In that moment, the fate of their world and of their friendship hung in the balance. The world seemed to hold its breath. Claire stood there, heart hammering in her chest. Every muscle tensed as she stared at the creature that had once been Emily. The orb pulsed above it like a beating heart, and the shadows twisted around her, a constant reminder of the overwhelming power that now controlled the very air around them. Emily, Claire whispered, her voice shaking but unwavering. She could feel the words inside her, a desperate plea, a final attempt to reach her friend before the reckoning consumed everything. This isn't you. Please. The creature, Emily, stood still for a long moment, its eyes searching Claire's face, as if contemplating the weight of her words. The light from the orb flared briefly, its light casting long shadows across the cavernous space. But Claire didn't look away. She couldn't. Not now. The figure before her shifted, an imperceptible motion, a sign that it was listening. Then, with a cold, hollow voice, it spoke. Don't you understand, Claire? The reckoning has already begun. It was always meant to happen. The truth has been revealed. The world as we know it is crumbling, and I am the catalyst for the change. The creature's voice, so alien, so distant, echoed through the cavern, each word vibrating in Claire's chest. This is the destiny I was chosen for. There's no going back. There is no going back, Claire. The finality in Emily's voice sent a chill through Claire's body. The reality of it, the weight of it was almost too much to bear. Emily, her friend, was now consumed by something far greater, something far darker. But there was still a flicker of doubt in those silver eyes, a trace of humanity, of the girl she once knew. Claire took a slow, steadying breath and took another step forward. She didn't know what she was going to say next, but she had to try. For both of them. Emily, Claire began, her voice trembling but full of unyielding resolve. I don't care what the reckoning has shown you. I don't care about the power, the truth, or whatever you think you've learned. You're my friend, and I know you're still in there. I know it. The reckoning doesn't control you. You're not just some force of nature. You're still you. The creature's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest of moments, Claire thought she saw the faintest flicker of recognition of Emily in the depths of its silver gaze. You think I don't want to remember? The creature asked, its voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. You think I haven't tried to hold on? But every time I do, the reckoning calls to me. It consumes me, Claire. The power is too great to ignore. The orb above Emily's head flared brightly in response, and Claire felt her stomach lurch. She knew that the longer she stood here, the more the reckoning would take hold of Emily. The creature's words were filled with truth, but it didn't change what Claire had to do. She couldn't let Emily become this. This thing. You don't have to fight it alone, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of determination. I'm here. I'm not leaving you. We can face this together. You don't have to give into the reckoning. We can find a way to stop it. Emily's form flickered once more, the shadows swirling around her body, as if struggling with the conflicting energies inside her. For a moment, the dark aura seemed to flicker, almost as if the reckoning's hold on her was slipping. But then, the orb pulsed brighter, and the darkness pressed down on Claire again, nearly suffocating her. Claire, Emily said, her voice now more strained. The silver light in her eyes dimmed just slightly. The reckoning is not something I can just walk away from. I've already seen what it can do, what it's going to do. The world will fall apart, and I was chosen to lead it. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she stepped forward, her heart aching with every word. Emily, no, you were never meant to lead anything. You were meant to live. We were meant to live. The reckoning isn't the answer, Emily. It's just a lie, a trap. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Emily's body twitched, her fingers curling into fists as the orb above her seemed to feed off the tension, pulsing with a force that seemed to rip the very fabric of the world apart. But then, Emily spoke again, her voice almost too quiet to hear. Is it a lie? She asked, her tone softer now. Or is it the truth? The reckoning shows me everything, I see everything, and I can't turn my back on it. The world is breaking, Claire, and nothing can stop it. You can, Claire said, her voice breaking through the thick air. You can stop it? Emily, you have the choice. You don't have to be this. Please, don't let this darkness take you completely. The shadows around Emily seemed to ripple in response to Claire's words, and for a moment, the orb flickered again, its light dimming as the creature's form trembled. Emily's eyes softened, just slightly, and Claire could feel the pull of the orb, its influence waning, if only by the smallest fraction. The faintest hope ignited in Claire's chest. But the orb's energy flared, a violent burst that threw Claire back, slamming her into the jagged rocks behind her. The world seemed to spin, the air vibrating with an overwhelming power. She gasped for breath, feeling as though the very air was choking her. Through the haze of pain and disorientation, Claire heard Emily's voice, now full of cold finality. "This is who I am now," the creature said, its voice distant. "This is the reckoning. I can't fight it anymore, Claire. It's too late." Claire's heart broke in that moment. The woman, the girl, she had fought for, loved, and stood beside for so long, was gone, and in her place stood something else, something powerful and beyond reach. But Claire refused to let go. She couldn't. With trembling hands, Claire reached in her pocket and pulled out the amulet, the one Emily had once given her, the symbol of their bond. The familiar weight of it, the connection it represented, sparked something within her, a fierce determination that burned hotter than the orb's light. She could feel the energy surging through it, as if it were reacting to the reckoning itself. With everything she had left, Claire rose to her feet, pushing against the darkness. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how, but she knew one thing. She couldn't give up. "Emily," Claire whispered, her voice louder now, stronger. "You are not the reckoning. You are you, and I'm not leaving you. I will bring you back." And with that, Claire stepped forward once more, determined to face whatever came next. The world around Claire seemed to fracture with every step she took toward Emily. The orb's light was blinding, flickering and crackling as if struggling against the pull of the amulet that still rested in Claire's palm. The energy in the air was thick, oppressive, and Claire could feel her heart racing as the world seemed to spin around her. The shadows, the darkness, it was all closing in, but she couldn't let it win. She couldn't let Emily go. With the amulet gripped tightly in her hand, Claire pushed forward, every ounce of her being focused on one singular thing, saving her friend. The orb flared in response, its light sharp and jagged, like a blade slicing through the air. The ground trembled beneath Claire's feet, as if the very earth itself was fighting to reject her. Emily's figure stood tall, unmoving, like an ethereal statue carved from darkness. Her silver eyes, once warm and full of laughter, were now cold and indifferent. The reckoning had taken root deep within her, and yet the faintest flicker of recognition of Emily remained within her, a glimmer of the person Claire had once known. "Please," Claire whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I know you're still there. I can feel you, Emily. The reckoning doesn't own you. You are not a monster." The creature, Emily, didn't move. Its eyes remained fixed on Claire, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of uncertainty. It was like a crack in the dam, the smallest sign that the tide could still shift. The shadows around her seemed to pulse, hesitating, as if aware of Claire's will, of the amulet's power. "Let me help you," Claire pleaded, her voice stronger now, reaching out with everything she had left. "I won't give up on you. I can't." For a moment, the orb above Emily's head flickered again, the pulse of energy slowing, just briefly, almost as though it was considering her words. But then the orb surged once more, its light overwhelming, and Claire was thrown backward, tumbling through the air as the energy around her intensified. With a force that sent waves of tremors through the cavern, the reckoning's hold on Emily tightened. The creature's form warped, shifting between the human and the monstrous, an impossible paradox of both. The shadows swirled around her like a cloak, and her eyes, now entirely silver, locked onto Claire with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "You can't stop this," the creature hissed, its voice laced with fury. "This is what I was meant for. This is who I am." But Claire, bleeding and battered, pushed herself to her feet. She could feel the connection to the amulet growing stronger, pulsing in rhythm with the broken fragments of Emily still left inside. The reckoning was powerful, yes, but it was not invincible. Not as long as Claire fought to hold onto the last shred of humanity that Emily had left. "I refuse to believe that," Claire said, her voice unwavering. "You're still you, Emily. You're not just a vessel for the reckoning. You are my friend." With those words, something inside Emily seemed to shift again. A tremor ran through her, and for the briefest of moments, her silver eyes softened, the shadows around her receding slightly. But then the orb pulsed, violently, its light flaring brighter than ever before. The ground shook violently as a massive crack split the earth beneath them, forcing Claire to steady herself once more. "No," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, as if struggling to regain control. "No, I can't fight it anymore." The reckoning's power surged, and Emily's form began to break apart, her human form shifting and warping, becoming a grotesque mockery of itself. The air around her thickened with the weight of darkness, and Claire felt the amulet pulse in her hand, as if it were screaming at her. Claire's heart tightened, but she couldn't give in. She couldn't lose Emily. With a final, desperate cry, Claire reached out, holding the amulet high. The light from the orb flared again, and she felt the darkness swirling around her, trying to tear her apart. The reckoning pressed down on her like 1,000 tons of weight, but she refused to let go. The amulet's glow intensified, fighting back the shadows, and in that moment, Claire made the only choice she could. She would fight for Emily, for both of them. The light from the amulet shot out in a beam of pure energy, crashing into the orb above Emily. A shockwave of force exploded outward, and Claire felt herself pushed back by the immense power of it. The shadows shrieked as they were torn apart by the light, the darkness unraveling as the amulet's power surged to its peak. And in the heart of it all, Emily's form wavered, flickering between light and dark as though struggling to remain whole. Claire screamed her name, reaching out, hoping, praying that this was enough. "Call me back," Claire cried, her voice breaking. "Come back to me, Emily." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The orb flickered once more, and Emily's eyes, those familiar human eyes, blinked. The shadows around her shattered, falling to the ground like ash. And then, with a final, devastating pulse of light, the orb exploded. When Claire opened her eyes, everything was still. The cavern had fallen silent. The orb was gone, its light extinguished, leaving only the faintest traces of its power lingering in the air. The shadows that had once enveloped Emily's form were gone, leaving only the girl standing before her, her eyes wide, full of confusion, pain, and something else, regret. "Claire!" Emily's voice was faint, trembling, as if she were waking from a nightmare. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she staggered forward, arms outstretched. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her chest. But in this moment, Emily, her Emily, was there. "Emily," Claire whispered, her voice hoarse, the word a prayer. "You're back. You're really back." Emily blinked, her expression still full of uncertainty. But as Claire reached her, Emily collapsed into her arms, a sob escaping her lips. I don't know what happened," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fight it. And then, it was too much." Claire held her tightly, the weight of it all crashing down around them both. "It's okay. It's over now. We're free." But as the light faded and the echoes of the reckoning fell silent, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The reckoning had been stopped, but its mark on the world, on them, would never fade. There was still much to be done, Still much to uncover. But for now, in that quiet aftermath, Claire held Emily, her friend, close, knowing that they had survived the unthinkable.